Welcome, everybody, to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's great to be with you today. Today, we have a conversation that I'm really looking forward to. It's a topic that we have covered only in a couple of episodes, really, on our platform, even over like the full 9 years, which is we're going to get into some history of Sudan, obviously the civil war, for lack of a better phrase, and maybe we'll talk about that term today in Sudan, has been one of the real global geopolitical flashpoints in the last several years. But it is also something that I think really evades good analysis from a lot of people, particularly in the West. It's not something I think that is well understood and certainly not talked about, to the degree that it should be. And obviously, a lot of attention necessarily and importantly has gone to, the Zionist genocide in Gaza. But this is an event that has also had an immense amount of destruction, included a lot of the same forms of warfare and violence, and yet there's a lot less kind of discussion about it. So I'm really excited about this book and our guest today that will help us not only talk about the present, but also talk about the history of Sudan, also get into psychology in, a really interesting way. Folks may have seen our guest's recent conversation with our friend and comrade, Lara Shihai, over on psychic militancy. I really recommend it if you haven't caught that as well. The book is Politically Unconscious, the Psychic Aftermath of the Sudanese Revolution. And I should say, I referenced the Civil War, which is more the present context, but the book does focus on the Sudanese Revolution and various components of that, which we will get into, as well as a lot of, history of Sudan and the left in Sudan. So really looking forward to that. So our guest is Mohamed Khougali, and he did let me know that that's an acceptable English variation of his name, that it's pronounced quite differently in Arabic, but I'm not going to insult him or my audience with my attempt to pronounce the Arabic pronunciation. So he is a Sudanese socialist writer and psychology practitioner based in Germany, where he continues to organize and serve as president of Black Radicals. His work engages questions of liberation and collective struggle through the combined lenses of the Black radical tradition and psychology theory. Drawing on both intellectual and organizational practice, his research explores the relationship between race, class, colonialism, and subjectivity, with a particular focus on the psychological dimensions of political life and anti-colonial resistance. And before I bring him to the stage, I do want to do a couple of things. One, encourage you, of course, to like, share, subscribe, get this conversation in front of as many people as possible. As my friend Adnan Hussein says, don't be stingy. Don't be selfish with the conversation. Share the information out there with folks. But also, in addition to that, go to the Iskra Books website, iskrabooks.org. You can download this book for free, right? And obviously, I really encourage people to purchase it, to support it, to physical copies of books, I think are really important, particularly in this age of large language models and, so-called AI and digitalization of everything. And support Iskra as a press, right? Support the production of books like this. But they do intentionally provide that free PDF, and I'm sure eventually there'll be a free EPUB version as well, which they do on all of their books now, because they also are committed to sharing, socialist books and making them freely available, and recognizing not everybody can afford, right, to purchase a physical copy as well. And they want that information to be out there and accessible to everybody. So I love the work that they do. This is another great addition to their catalog, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So without further ado, Mohammed, welcome. It's good to be with you.
It's good to have. It's good to be here, and um, yeah, thank you for pronouncing the the last name correctly in English, I suppose. But yeah, it's good to be here with you, and I have to say, honestly, I've been listening to Millennials Architect Capitalism for a long time now, and yeah, just shout out to you guys and the awesome work that you do. And yeah, you guys actually got me into the works of someone like Alana Linton. Big shout out to her. And which precipitated basically a 30 book voyage into like a black radicalism. So big shout out for you with the work that you guys do and everything at Medina Zakir and Capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Shout out to Alana as well. Yeah, that concept of racial regimes, which of course, Cedric Robinson was very important in theorizing in forgeries of memory and meaning. Yeah, is one that you utilize, I think, quite interestingly to talk about, Sudan as well. So, yeah, thank you for that, and of course, thank you for the shout out. I appreciate it. Let's start with the Civil War, and I kind of put that in scare quotes, but I don't know whether it should be, and that's one of the things I think that's interesting to get your perspective on is how do we kind of understand this current war, right, that's taking place in Sudan. You talk about it as being fundamentally linked to global capitalist and imperialist structures. You particularly note, of course, the role of the UAE and Israel as well. So just explain a little bit of the kind of your understanding and the how and why of why you look at it that way. And then obviously we're gonna that might be a bad way to start for some of us because I think the prehistory of all of that is really, really important. But I do think that a lot of people see it, right, as a news item or something in their feeds, but still don't really have a great understanding. I think there has been a better understanding in the last couple of years of something like the UAE's role. But talk a little bit about the current context in Sudan.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think yeah, I mean, just to reference what you mentioned last, which is I think many people today when they're reading about Sudan in the news, one of the things that is a feature of almost most articles and most news feeds is the role of the UAE in funding the paramilitary forces, which is the Rapid Support Forces or the RSF, which are the forces who are committing the majority of the atrocities that we see across our social media feeds and such. And I think for the book, what I try to do is, try to historicize this a little bit. So while yes, this moment captures this link quite, succinctly and maybe even the most egregious demonstration of the link between, Sudan or imperialism's effects on Sudan or like the UAE's influence in Sudan, there is a history behind it because it's not like as I demonstrate in the book, it's not like spontaneously the UAE and the RSF sort of came together and formed this link um, in the destruction of Sudan. What I try to say in the book basically, and this is perhaps the history that you're pointing to, is that this link has been fostered, it has been lubricated, it has been sort of, worked on by the capitalist classes of Sudan themselves. So for a long time, while today, for example, it's quite intuitive, and I think for many people who follow what's going on in Sudan, or even people who are just in, follow it like prefer, like on the side, like a peripheral issue, they see that there's cause to like condemn and like to call out the UAE's effects. And I think that's, of course, that's necessary and it's very important and essential. But when we do call them, I mean, there's two problems here. When we do call them out, who are we calling them out for? We're telling basically like I don't know, international organizations to step in, like the UN, and like stop these people and stop like the arming and so on and so forth. And I think maybe this is an ideal sort of situation where the UN would step in and the US and Western powers would be like, yeah, we're not going to do deals with the UAE anymore because it's killing people in Sudan. But I think, as we've seen with the genocide with the Zionist entities genocide in Palestine, like this is just not going to happen. You know what I mean? Like it's, they're not motivated by sort of a quote unquote humanist or ethical principles. And so, what is important for us as revolutionaries is to understand where this link comes from specifically. And where this link comes from specifically is a historic question. It's not just the RSF right now who have been exploiting or have been not even exploiting, but like taking advantage of this relationship, this imperialist relationship between the capital accumulation in Sudan and the capital accumulation of the Gulf and the larger West Asia and North Africa, through places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait and so on and so forth, the Gulf countries. But rather, we need to look at the history, and to fight it, for us to fight it, we need to fight not just these links, but also those who've created these links, which is our own capitalist classes in Sudan. Just to put a long story short, sorry.
No, thank you. And I know we'll dig into some of this as we go through the conversation for sure. So another another kind of call in your book is for leftist movements to abandon moral puritanism for a more militant and strategically flexible anti-imperialism. Um, can you just talk a little bit about that? Like, talk a little bit about what you see as this kind of moral puritanism that you're kind of locating, and yeah, a little bit more of kind of what you're critiquing there and thinking about as the alternative that you want to propose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the moral puritanism that I'm talking about is sort of this insular nature within the left to sort of claim a sort of somewhat a moral high ground based on what they see as the objective truth about reality. Um, and the reason why I say it's insular, it's because you see your initiative not necessarily as like building solidarities, but as getting to the absolute truth of what's going on the ground, which is all truths are sort of fallible. But what I mean by this is maybe to historicize it a little bit is for the past couple of decades the left has been defeated, and I don't blame like when I say like moral puritanism, like it's not I don't say it like maybe it comes off as an insult or something like this, but it's more something as a reality, right? It's like when you're defeated, when you're in a position in which like you don't have as much political or social power, and maybe you've been crushed for so many decades, you need to retain sort of your existence somehow. And some of the ways in which people retain this sort of relevance and existence is by sort of becoming more insular, becoming more introspective, becoming more sort of, okay, the problem is that this person has thought about this. And like you become even sometimes in a lot of these left wing spaces, it can be a little bit even paranoia or paranoid about certain things. Um, and like, I'm not saying like, sometimes we can be adversarial about these spaces and so on and so forth. But I think more so we should understand it as just a symptom of like people who have tried to fight for so long in the most sort of harshest climates. And naturally they develop this sort of puritanism. And the reason why I say we need to abandon this necessarily is because, in a weird way, it sort of blinds us to, liberatory horizons that other people have been fighting and conceptualizing. And I think today's moment is a very sort of insightful one, where I was just on my Instagram feed, and here on the left in Germany, the Marxist left in Germany are having this big debate about the religious question. Should we use religion or should we abandon religion? And what does religion have to? And these kinds of questions, which are, I think, a symptom of like this Puritanism. Whereas, as a matter of fact, it's a problem because the people who are actually fighting imperialism in West Asia they themselves are, they identify their struggle with religion. You know what I mean? Their liberatory horizons with religion. But not only that, at this moment where there's an insurgency in the left, when there's like, for after however many decades, there's this moment with the destruction of Palestinian lives, it has brought about like a revival of a radical left. And, this Puritanism sort of stifles it because you're still hung up for the question of like, oh, but these people are not like, they haven't thought about it as we did, or they didn't use the same language as we did, which can be very like divisive, and it's going to create a lot of splinters. And I think, just to give it maybe like some sort of philosophical juice, we have to understand that even for Marxist or for Marx himself, right? You can read Marx however you want to read Marx. You can read him purely. You can read him with like the help of like Adorno, or like, I don't know, someone like David Harvey or so, or like the latest version with Reiner, stuff like this. But what Marx, one of his, major contributions was an understanding of history. How is it that simultaneously we can reasonably understand history, and it's sort of like almost deterministically, if even that word is a little bit flawed, but also retain some sort of agency in changing history itself. Whatever you think about the debate or Marxism, whatever, this debate, has been going on for centuries, I would even say millennia. For example, hundreds of years ago, religious people are talking about how is it that God, through his will, created the world as it unfolds, but yet with, making prayer towards God changes the will of God itself. Now, when you read this, you're like, okay, this sounds like religious, whatever, theological, debates or whatever. But here, what these theologians are trying to do, which is something similar to Marx, is trying to understand how we understand history through like making sense of it historically, but also our place in, and our agency within history itself. Millions of people believe believe in this, which is a form in itself of, historical materialism, but it's just not called historical materialism. And so when you're a Puritan, and you sort of not just forego how people think about these things, and think about them in very enlightened ways and very sort of meaningful ways, and ways that informs their praxis, their resistance, um, in order for you to retain some sort of moral authority. And I think for the left, I think we need to be a little bit better than that, is what I roughly meant.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it's a big problem, and I think locating it within that history of defeat is correct. I actually remember Vijay Prashad talking about this at one point when he was talking to some folks, I think at maybe the People's Forum in New York, and somebody was talking about like some debate. I don't even remember what the question was, right? But it was around a political line, and he was just like, this this rigid um obsession with the political line being absolutely correct on every single question is a product of defeat within Western communist, Marxist movements, essentially. That when you're defeated and when you lose and when you are so far from political power, you can become obsessed with having the right answer to every single thing. And, he's like, that's not politics. Like, it's not how organizing and building, actually works in places that have large left movements. There's more, which is not to say that they don't have political lines, right? But there's more flexibility and openness to the different views and perspectives of various people, because you have to figure out how are you gonna, you have to mobilize millions of people, presumably, right? And they're not all going to just say, yeah, we adopt this line and we totally agree on it, right?
For
Yeah.
sure. For sure. I think he's absolutely right. And I think, I 100% agree with you in the sense that when you're in the middle of the shit, sorry, when you're in the middle of the struggle, right? Like you're going to science in itself, which is important in order for us to even reproduce ourselves to understand the world, is a social phenomena. You know what I mean? And like you might disagree, you might even sort of think that the people are having discussions that you've had 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but they're really not. They might echoes in it, but like there are nuances within it that is important for the current context that sort of, presents sort of like a splinter in which you can go, or like a rupture in which you can go through and develop new knowledge and so on and so forth. And I think we miss that if we just I don't know, dissolve all knowledge into like language, or something like that. I don't know what kind of philosophical basis that is, analytical philosophy or whatever. But yeah, I absolutely agree.
So do you want to say though, you sort of spoke about the moral puritanism, and you kind of, I think, answered the alternative, but maybe say a little bit more about, your own experiences here, because this is also informed, I think, in part by, the Sudanese Revolution, and as well as being, as you have been, back and forth between different places in Europe and encountering, I'm sure, the left in those places as well. And what are you kind of proposing in terms of a slightly different, I guess, praxis or way of orienting ourselves towards anti-imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe this preempts the question about psychotherapy a little bit. So apologies, um, but I think what I'm proposing is, which comes to the psychological theory that I developed in the book, which is the fundamental question in order for us, the one that we need to resolve. In fact, I would say the fundamental question that separates humans as a species from anything else is basically, how is society in a way that is legible to us? So how can we make, because I think, you know maybe let me just historicize this a little bit. Whenever I go to left wing circles, or whenever I go to, even during therapy, whenever I give therapy, I think one of the things that I encounter is this, in left wing circles, is this stuckedness. It's like, there's this, people are stuck in a certain way, this puritanism, in a certain way. What I encounter, this stuckedness, for example, I find it in therapy theories of psychotherapy, let's say, is this fundamental question of, does man reproduce society, or does society reproduce man? Which for me was a little bit difficult to work. Was a little bit difficult for me to swallow. Basically, it wasn't something that I could make sense of, right? Um, And so, when it came to the Sudanese revolution, we're in a moment of like upheaval, a moment of revolt, and you experience certain things. I talked in one podcast about, for example, how when someone used to die, we used to, or like when someone was martyred during one of the revolutionaries, all of us in our thousands, we would sort of walk to the martyr's parents, their mother, and be like, Shuhada, what's it called? Damm al-shahid dammi, al-shahid ummi, which means like the blood of the martyr is my blood. The mother of the martyr is uh, the mother of the martyr is my mother. So instead of losing one son, you've gained thousands. And I talked about how this was in itself a revolutionary moment. This was the civilizing moment under someone who's been sort of reproduced and produced under capitalism. And there was moments during the revolution where you sort of instinctually, find yourself sort of almost challenging things that you knew about society, experiencing things that you haven't experienced before. I'm sure people, who are listening to this, who are either part of the revolution, or like or any revolution, or like a resistance towards ICE, or organizing, to destroy certain, let's say, outlet systems, or whatever it is, you find in the solidarity, you find, the people that you're around, there's something different. You cultivate a solidarity with these people that is quite significant. It's a moment like to behold, you know what I mean? It's something that you have in your head. And I always think about it like during the revolution, it's like there's a small spark, a flame that stays in your heart when you're a revolutionary, when you've been part of that process. And it stays in your heart. It never really goes away. It's sort of, sometimes it flares up, sometimes it's dimmed, but it's always stays there, once you're a revolutionary, once you've cultivated this sort of solidaristic ties. Now, the problem for me is like imagine having that and experiencing these moments where you see what people have sacrificed and what people are willing to sacrifice to be there with you and so on and so forth. And then you come to the left here in Germany, and they're having debates about whether we should have religion or not. You know what I mean? Like it's just quite funny, or it's quite disappointing, so to speak. When it comes to psychotherapy, so I'm going between psychotherapy and the left. But when it comes to psychotherapy, I was disappointed that it didn't capture that, and it could never capture that for one particular reason, which is like I said, psychotherapy theory, implicitly or explicitly, is stuck in the question of does man reproduce society or does society reproduce man? Meaning that, you know, um, for most theory, there is this sort of determined element about like, man and society being somewhat together. And the reason why I say it's determined somewhat is because you're either saying that man creates society, so society is nothing but the will of man or humans, the will of humans that have always been, and so on and so forth. And this sort of dissolves any sort of revolutionary potential because it's just, the liberal pluralism and like we need to be together and just the will of the people prevails and all these kinds of things, which is not true because there's structures that stop us from willing things into being, of course, and willing things into being is like almost a fantasy. But they say this so like you have a moment of relief under the mute compulsion of capitalism. And then there's another kind of psychology theory which suggests that, for example, man is created, society creates man. And this, I think, people might be familiar with if you have like a child or like a baby. The first one of the things that people tell you is like, you need to get away from like these urban spaces. You need to go like, stay with your family. You need to be like in like this recluse. Like a baby needs to have like a better space. And the reason why implicitly is like the argument is if they're in a society in which there are what they see as like violence or whatever, they're going to inherit this violence because society creates and sort of like a Durkheimian sort of worldview or whatever. And I thought, well, both sort of doesn't work in theorizing adequately the feelings that we were having. And I think one of the people who I was reading at the time, and I think I was attracted to his work, was Roy Pascal in that separating society from man, and in so doing, sort of giving humans the autonomy and understanding their autonomy and how, uh, you know, meaning making is important in order to reproduce the self and so on and so forth. I go into more detail about it, but just for us, I think the important thing is how deeply implicated psychotherapy theory is in, you know, anti-revolutionary sort of subjectivities and psychological and our psychological theory. Sorry to go. I think I said a lot of things, but directly tackling your question was not it.
It's all good. We will keep moving through, and I appreciate those reflections. And I was you made a comment there about Germany and God. And I mean, it's such a funny thing because it's like also this. I also see this reaction, and I mentioned before we started that we had recently had this conversation with Farwa Seal and Fadia Nabwa Fikri on Islam, and looking at different historical currents, right? Looking at revolutionary or communist infused currents in Southeast Asia, for instance, and looking at Wahhabism, which Farwa's work really looks at that as a kind of imperial project, right? And um, but what was interesting in the chat, right? Because in some ways, I was, of course, having that conversation, and we talked about this a little bit afterwards. I was having the conversation, of course, thinking about it from a left that is, I mean, I don't know how prominent Marxism actually is within the left in the West, but it's there. It's a thing, and it definitely we have a large infusion of kind of secular, uh, thinking around the left in the West. Let me just put it that way. Whether you are Marx certainly is one strain of that, but also many strains of whether it's anarchism or different variants of liberalism that are kind of left leaning. That emphasis on the secular. So in my mind, a lot of the conversation I'm having it in part because of that, right? And trying to open up spaces for people in the West to understand that when we talk about something like Islam, it's not just one thing. It's not just a particular political current. These things, which your book does a fantastic job, by the way, of talking about this, of delving through, the histories of the building of different sectarian, groups and things like this, right? And how these are historically developed. And that's the case, I think, in every country, right? Regardless of religion, not even just particular to Islam, right? Um, and it was funny because, of course, Farwa and Fadia are coming to it from a different perspective to some degree, right? Coming from thinking in relation to majority Muslim societies and thinking about the left, right? But what was also fascinating was all the comments. Right, and so you have people that are coming from a variety of reasons too, and one of the things you see also, of course, is certain people who are Muslim who have a very negative experience with communists or Marxists and think about it really within these terms of being very antagonistic to their spiritual, faith-based projects. And I mean, and we can talk about maybe this is a good way to kind of transition in some ways to a discussion of the left within Sudan, right? Because you do talk about the history of the left. I don't know if we want to go to you have the concept of the irrational revolution, but let's table that for a second. Talk a little bit about just the history of the left within Sudan, which might be a good way to kind of bridge from those random comments I just threw out at you.
I don't think they're random. I think also they're, you know, oof. I'm gonna ask this question because it's such a it's for me it's such a fresh in my mind kind of comment and theme.
Yeah, please.
Um, I'm not what's it called? I don't. I'm not going. I'm gonna be a little bit ambitious and be like, okay, I'm gonna end the religious debate here. But what I said earlier about like one of the central, let's say, questions that separates us as a species from anything else is basically why is society legible to us, and how is society in a way that is legible to us, right? And I think a lot of a lot of people think that let's say gravity or like our ability to observe certain physical dynamics or whatever it is, it just is because it just is, like it just happens to be. But actually there is the fact that we're able to observe or understand or try to have a theory of history, gravity, or whatever it is, it's actually a crazy thing in itself. Like, there's no other species that has this ability that allows it to theorize about why we even know how these things relate to us or how we know these things. And the reason why is because this fundamentally is a transcendental sort of claims that every human being has to make implicitly or explicitly. Meaning that we see what's happening in front of us, I mean, to different degrees. Um, you have, for example, empiricists that say that the world is made out of a mosaic of like atomistic facts, and we need to get as many sort of data about these atomistic facts to make like a to understand what the real reality is and stuff like this. This itself is transcendental claim because it suggests that, one day we are going to know the facts about reality, which is not the case. This is, you're making a claim, right? Here it gets to the question of religion, is because people make these claims literally as an like it's just by our very nature as human beings, we need to make these claims about why we understand these things in every moment, or in every sort of in our lives. This is why human beings are just not rid of religion. you know Religion seems to be one of the intuitive ways in which you can make these claims, and it can be as complicated as you want it to be, like the example that I gave earlier about how is it that God sort of creates everything, but our supposedly our will or our prayers can change God's will itself. And what does the world of autonomy, which, later on when you secularize it, becomes like historical materialism, which is also somewhat mixed like claims, but that's a little bit too difficult to, maybe we can get onto it later. um, but there are claims, and it can be as simple as, for example, everything belongs to God, we're all equal under God, and that's it. That's all I need to know, and it's good enough. And these claims are made based on like the social context and so on and so forth. To collapse these ontological claims, which are, fundamentally can be spiritual, can be religious, can be secular, can be whatever it is, can be materialist, it's just you need to make these claims. Religious people and non-religious people have had wild wild claims to make, about the nature of reality and how we relate to it. And so, for when people say, for example, it's only like religious people are superstitious, or like they believe in certain things that don't make sense and so on and so forth, I think for us as Marxists, we're the last people to speak, because, some of us believe that what's coming next is going to be socialism. And if you just look outside your window, you know, the rupture is gonna come sooner before socialism. It seems like it, what I mean? So maybe religious people have something to offer. But yeah, that just reflections on what you mentioned. So sorry to indulge your yours and I's tangents.
No, it's all good. The tangents are great. I mean, it actually to go on another tangent, and I don't expect you to respond to this one because then we'll truly go back to the book. But we saw Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, and we did an episode critiquing it. Like, I do think it's a bad movie. I do think it promotes evil ideologies in my view. Like, and I don't mind making that moral claim. But the um the thing that was interesting, right, is that people were one of the complaints is like, well, he doesn't show the gods in the film. Like, he doesn't actually show Zeus, he doesn't actually show Poseidon, and so on and so forth. And what he does is he uses thunder. He uses a storm that would keep someone at sea for years, right? Like, and so even though I have all my critiques of that film, that's actually correct, right? Is that the in order to understand gods, like, you have to understand that it's a system of meaning making that makes sense of things that people experience and observe within the world, right? And the same thing, could be said also about science a lot of the time, right? And I am somebody who upholds science as a really important and a critical tool, and obviously as somebody who leans into the Marxists trajectory. I really value it, but it's also produced many times understandings of the world that don't actually explain it and actually in many instances are proven to be incorrect, right, as well, right? And so all of it, just to kind of, I think, connect to the point that you're making, is that the people in the world have different ways of making sense of things, and to completely shut ourselves off from each other and think that we can't organize or work together or build together in some kind of way because of some of these differences, is its own form of sectarianism, even if it's not like the same as a religious sectarianism necessarily, or a left sectarianism. It's a form of kind of isolating yourself and not understanding what you're talking about the various ways that people can make meaning. And even if they make that meaning or understanding differently, you can still form alliances and you can still find ways to work together because very often you still understand, things within the world that are destructive and, and so there's different grammars and ways of making meaning that I think people can still come to those conclusions. So
Yeah.
let's get back to the book. Oh, did you want to say something?
Just one last thing. I think I 100% agree with you, and I think it's a mark of a great scientist actually. Not that they perform scientific experiments or whatever, but mark of a great scientist, in my opinion, is that they're able to take what people have said and make sense of it. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of times, like, but this person didn't use this word to describe this thing or whatever. This is not a mark of a great, like, I mean, which is basically our academic, style of doing knowledge today. But that's really not science. I think a great mark of a scientist is like someone who can look at what's the resistance going on, and for example, Hezbollah, for example, listen to what they have to say in the words of Hassan Nasrallah, Allah yarhamu, may he rest in peace, and so on and so forth, and be like, okay, yes, of course, if you just give it directly to like some Western audience or whatever, they might have like objections to like certain things or whatever. But a good revolutionary, a good scientist, I think will take that and be like, okay, I understand exactly, what the person is, not in a patronizing way or whatever, but even in a sympathetic and even ways that it's like, okay, yeah, I think you're right about saying this at this time and this moment. And in fact, doing science with the particular, revolutionary movements and so on and so forth, maybe you would contribute something, maybe they would contribute something to your thinking and so on and so forth. That's a sign of a great scientist. Not people who just sit down, like invent new words to further, elevate themselves further and further away from like the masses. I don't know if that's science, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. All right. So let's go to the concept of the irrational revolution, which is important to your book. You use it with respect to Sudan and look at it historically in relation to the potential and suppression of the left. So talk a little bit about the historical dynamics that you're seeking to trace here.
Yeah, the historic dynamics that I am seeking to place. Well, first of all, after the revolution, what we see today is it didn't bring about, or the Arab Spring, generally speaking, it didn't bring about, a liberatory sort of vision, whether, like, that, like for example, a socialist government didn't hold office and distribute wealth or whatever. It didn't have these the aims that we had, and not only just the aims that we had, but even what we were practicing during the revolution. Those moments that I told you were sort of very meaningful. They weren't translated into the post-revolution period. One of the reasons for this was, and many people say this is because there was no robust left, and I think this is accurate. But also, you know, it's sort of an easy structural answer to many questions. You can basically say that about why did this fail? There was not an organized left, and it could be true. It is like structurally true. But what I wanted to do historically, to get back to your question, is understand why this was the case. And so the endeavor to understand this is basically to trace back the history of the left in Sudan and the various dynamics that were taking place. Now, in order for me to do this, first of all, I sort of tried to make sense of the revolution in Sudan. And I start off by, so not critiquing, but saying that to use the concept of the quote unquote bourgeois revolution, which is usually what describes certain epoch moments of, like, shifting, maybe transitional periods from feudalism to capitalism. It also describes the coming about of like the modern America or the modern United States or whatever it is. And I said to use this sort of in what's going on in Sudan, not just today, but like even like before colonialism, during colonialism. It's a little bit maybe analytically, it doesn't fit. Sudan is not like France, it's not like England, and so on and so forth. And so I come up with the concept of the irrational revolution, which granted, maybe I should write something a little bit more on because I don't go into too much depth in the book. But what I mean by it basically is that, you know, there is, when it comes to capitalism, or any other system really, but when it comes to capitalism, for example, there is somewhat a reason behind how society, or behind how dynamics of social reproduction sort of unfold. So, you know, a good example I would use, and something that you mentioned in your intro, for example, is AI. And I used this example before, but you know, you could be working in an office and your boss would come and be like, from September onwards, we're going to be introducing AI, and this is going to be, you know, everyone needs to go use this program. And so you sort of train this program and so on and so forth. And then you know, maybe you might have people laid off. Maybe you're going to provide another service that's going to make your life miserable, because inevitably it's going to be a service that's shit. And you're stuck there sort of doing after the care labor for this machine, basically, the emotional labor for this machine, basically. Um, but when the bosses come and say this to you, they do it in a way that seems sort of secular, in a sense that, you know, it's not my will. This is just technological development. It's the way, you know, if we want to keep up with what's going on, this is what the next technological step is going to be. And that's it. There's a naturalized way of doing things. Under capitalism, there's a lot of claims in that. And one of the major ones is, you know, that if you do, which is the social contract, or the racial contract in some cases, but the social contract would suggest that if you do the right thing at the right time, the next generation is going to have better outcomes, generally speaking. There's a lot of claims about that capitalism does, that forces us to do things that we fundamentally don't want. No one wants AI. No one's ever opted to do it. And everyone who's used it knows that basically the care labor that you put in to these machines is much more tiresome than what you would have done if you had to do the tasks. You know what I mean? I'm not saying I am a Luddite, so to speak, but like these, you know, like it doesn't make sense. And everyone knows that, for example, especially under neoliberalism, that, you know, your outcomes are not as good as your parents. In fact, the moments in which your outcomes are as good as your parents were very brief under capitalist history, and you know, before that, it wasn't the case, basically. And we know that, you know, social mobility is a myth, but we know, people know this. It's not like people are duped, and which you know, there's people who believe that, you know, ideology has, people are becoming stupid because, you know, they don't know what's best for them. That's not the case. Every person knows, not every person, but the vast majority of people knows that, you know, the things, the claims, the rational claims that are made within capitalism, they're false. But even though we know this, we act as if we don't know it. We act as if we naturalize it. You know what I mean? We sort of, okay, fair enough, we're going to train this AI and so on and so forth. Now, why is it the case that we act this way? It's because basically, if we don't act this way, you know, violence is going to ensue. So, for example, if you, I don't know, if you tell your boss, no, actually, I'm not going to train AI or whatever, you're going to be disciplined in some way or the other. If you, for example, don't believe, like, if you don't, for example, act in a way that the next generation is going to reap the rewards of the hard work that you're doing today, a there's no mechanism for you to like oppose it, in a sense, and the way that you oppose it basically is going to maybe mean starvation for you. You might have to go for, like, you know, in order for you to even access to like some sort of welfare or whatever, you need to basically start working and eating shit from the age of 18 to like 62 or 70 or whatever it is nowadays, in order for you to basically not starve, even though you know that this is nonsense. The irrational revolution then is people that come out and proclaim what they already know, that this is nonsense, and by doing so enter into direct conflict, enter into direct, you know, class warfare, or whatever it is, uh, at the time, but enter into direct conflict. And that's how I sort of understood the the current moment in Sudan, which is a continuation of this irrational revolution. Um, yeah, and maybe I'll stop there, and I can go into the history of it in a bit.
Yeah, let's do the history in a bit, but say a little bit more about why you describe it as irrational. Is it because it's opposed to the rationality of the system, or like what is the yeah.
I think both. I mean, I'm preempting what you were going to say next, but I think both, which is first of all, it goes against the quote unquote rationalism of the system, but it's also irrational because you know that by saying no, or by claiming that this is basically nonsense, you're going to get into a class or a warfare that basically has the ability to wipe you out. You know what I mean? Like, your self, this is the moment where, to use sort of old Marxian terms, this is the moment where, for example, the working class stands up and proclaims that I want class warfare with the capitalist. You know what I mean? It's how this is it. This is what I want. And I think, this it's for me personally, it's immature, or like it's still a young concept, this irrational revolution, for me, in my mind. But I think if we were to look at history, wherever there have been like this open conflict waged, because there's always conflict waged by the capitalist classes, but when there is a conflict directly waged by the working classes and the racialized classes and whatever, like the wretched of the earth, basically, you see them making this declaration. You know what I mean? And it becomes so violent, and it's funny. I'm just thinking now that you have asked me the question. I haven't thought about it in this depth, but it seems even when you make these declarations, the declaration seems to be violent in itself, even though it's not. It's just saying that it's irrational. You know what I mean? We can think about this in terms of, like, I don't know, apartheid South Africa, when black people are trying to uh, at least achieve parity, equality. You'd be like, oh, they want equality, but there's way too many of them, and we don't know what kind of evil they're going to bring about. You know what I mean? Like these things, it seems automatically to the dominant discourse, that is a violent claim. Similarly, when, like, obviously we see this today, it's so natural for people to be like, from the river to the sea, pass now will be free. It seems like just as a matter, a lukewarm sentence or whatever. But obviously, to the mainstream, it sounds like a violent declaration of war, and I think it is, at a deep level.
Yeah, thank you. Um all right, so let's talk a little bit about sectarianism. Yeah, let's talk about the history of this within Sudan. In the West, I think this is a conversation that's sometimes difficult to translate to some degree, although it shouldn't be, because we use the term sectarianism most often in the West to talk about like debates between, one communist party and another, and Trotskyist versus folks who follow Mao, like these kinds of things, and the fighting, right, that happens between different forces that share a whole lot, right, in terms of their kind of vision of liberation, but often disagree on smaller things, and then sometimes it's about like how to get there and that kind of stuff. But there are some ways I think that that term sectarianism um, is useful even in that mold to some degree. But obviously, in a lot, I think this comes up very often within societies that have been colonized, right? Like that there is a fomenting of certain sects and of these these animosities that then um, become a kind of form of doing politics. That benefits a specific group of people, right? And you're thinking about in the Sudanese context, you're talking about the historic development of, modern day sectarianism and the role that this has played within Sudanese political life, which I think it's really important for people to understand this. And I think that even though these dynamics produce different formations in different countries kind of around the world, that there are some similarities in those processes of development that are really important to kind of attune to. So yeah, share what you want about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think to relate it to Sudan, for example, before going to the imperial dynamics, sectarianism in Sudan sort of, came or not came about, cemented after or during the period or a little bit after independence. And I think, like in a lot of post or previously colonized countries, the question of independence holds so much weight naturally, naturally holds so much weight at the moment of, like, the birth of a new nation or the birth of an independence, that some elites take this moment and take this sort of social, moral, sort of political credit or cachet and forge around it sort of a totalizing sort of vision. And from there, this is where you get sort of generate some sort of sectarianism. Sectarianism in Sudan, for example, there's two main parties that I talk about in the book, but to make it sort of more, for people who haven't read the book, or sort of more intuitive, it's when that becomes such a strong sort of drive of national identity, who brought about independence and so on and so forth. This is the moment where, for example, like I said, these elites take this sort of cachet and sort of create it into like some sort of identity. And then this identity then is projected forward. Here is where the sort of this dogmatic, sectarianism come in place. It's projected forward. There's no a for the Sudanese case, at least, like, behind it, the struggle for independence, wasn't as directly it wasn't as directly like a direct conflict as, for example, Algeria, as an example. In fact, independence for Sudan didn't necessarily mean a complete change and a complete shift from, like, certain policies and dynamics that exploited very, very mass numbers of people. I mean, after independence in itself, certain elites and certain dictators sort of not just perpetuated, but like created destructive forms of organizing society, intensified racism, for example, within society, and continued destruction and capital accumulation, and capitalist property relations, and so on and so forth. But what the legitimacy it's retained, especially for some mainstream parties in Sudan, is through this dogmatic sectarianism. For the history specifically, like I said, the moment of independence was very important. The people that leapt onto this moment were, one sectarian group called, one of the main sectarian groups is called the Ummah Party, which is today is in existence in Sudan. The Ummah Party in itself, the leaders of them, the reason why I think a lot of people call them sectarian is because the leaders of the Ummah Party are direct direct descendants of a person called Muhammad Ahmed Abdullahi, or Muhammad Ahmed al-Mahdi, who himself was at the late 19th century sort of revolted against the Anglo-Egyptian and Turco-Egyptian sort of a colonialism of Sudan. He's a major, revolutionary figure in Sudan. Some people have their critiques of him and so on and so forth, and some critiques are valid, others I think are a little bit inflated. But he's a major, whatever you say, he is a major figure in Sudan. He's a major figure in Sudanese history. And so the reason why they people call them sectarian is because the direct descendants of this person sort of run this political party in itself and get this is what I mean by they get this cachet. Whenever they were Sudan had three parliamentarian periods, from post-independence, after independence for a couple of years, then from the mid to late 60s, then from the mid to late 80s. So there's three parliamentary periods in Sudan. All of them they were involved in, and in fact, were president or prime ministers, and had like this particular party had like major role in it. And even during transitions, democratic transitions in Sudan, they had a role in it. And even during periods of dictatorship, they even played a role in, like, some governing, and like, at least, having a lukewarm relationship with the dictators at the time, depending on which dictator. It's up and down, but they have not produced any sort of shift or a difference, or any sort of they haven't produced anything meaningful for the people of Sudan. And so we call them sectarianism. I think is because that's the only legitimacy that they have, is like this inflation of a national or a certain identity that they hold.
Yeah, thank you. I realized one question I didn't prep that I'll come back to later, but I do want to talk more about the construction of race and racial regimes in Sudan. I think it's a really interesting kind of example to think with. Um, well, let's talk about, because you do trace the history of communist politics in Sudan, and how the defeat, or absorption, co-optation, like kind of the role that this party has taken historically, the defeat of these political tendencies. So yeah, I'm interested in the history, and then kind of how you see the afterlives of that defeat in terms of the role of the left, and organized left in Sudan.
Yeah, I think like I was saying earlier, right? It's not enough just to be like the reason why the Sudanese Revolution did not continue, and like did not produce, or many of the Arab Spring Revolution did not produce outcomes favorable towards like a liberatory vision. That this was because there wasn't a lack of a left. So in this, my motivation was to trace, like, okay, where was the left, and what does the left even mean in Sudan, and so on and so forth. And to understand it, I think there was actually a very vibrant left in Sudan. In fact, the Communist Party of Sudan was one of the major parties, if not the major party, the major communist party at the time. And we have to understand like how interesting this is, and actually quite an important, important accomplishment. The reason why it's interesting and important, it's not just because the numbers that they had, and like the organizing that they did, which I talked about elsewhere, which is in itself very, very interesting. But Sudan, it is not like, for example, Egypt with like Jamal Abdel Nasser, for example, or Syria with the Ba'athist Party, or the Iraq with the Ba'athist Party, and so on and so forth. Relatively, Sudan didn't get as much support. The Sudanese Communist Party didn't get as much support from the USSR, for example, because they didn't want to upset, their basically like their direct line with Egypt, for example. You know what I mean? Seeing Egypt as like, the necessary place to fund to stop sort of US influence, and so on and so forth, or to develop it. Like, this is a strategic important area. And so you have within the shadows of what's going on around, with pan-Arab movements, and Arab socialism, and funding from the USSR, and so on and so forth. You have these, basically, you know, people in Sudan, communist, who develop really meaningful praxis, and a vibrant sort of tradition of communism, and things that they developed their own, and relating to the environment in which they existed. We talked about this question earlier about like the question of religion, and such. For the Communist Party of Sudan, which was somewhat different than other communist party in West Asia and North Africa. For them, they are like, and one of the main figures, talk about him in all all my interviews, but Abdul Khalik Mahjoub, he says that, for example, it's not about religion, it's not about you being, I don't know, a Christian or Muslim or whatever it is. This is not the case that we're. It's not what communism is. It's, our number one enemy is like imperialism, and these capitalist forces, and so on and so forth. And they were practicing that at the moment where, like, the orthodoxy was like atheism, or like secularism within these Marxist discourses or parties in the region. But not only that, you know, for them, remember how I said, the sectarians sort of got like this political cachet by like, see forging their identity as like this, the midwives to Sudanese independence and their lineage to uh, um, Muhammad Ahmed al Mahdi, Muhammad Ahmed Abdullahi. Um, this the Sudanese Communist Party were like, yeah, independence is important, but we don't. We This is the part that I talked about before, but we we don't. It's not. We need to focus on how we should understand independence. We shouldn't do it in the sense that we tie ourselves with like these sectarian parties or these elites, let's say, but we need to sort of separate from them, create our own movements, and be in working class neighborhoods instead of constantly relying on these alliances, which even till this day, I think the left is guilty of like relying on alliances with like I don't know, um, bourgeois or elite or liberal organizations and so on and so forth. This was a history that one is proud of. You're like, wow, okay, this was a communist party that, it's really doing important, meaningful work. And the things that Abdul Khalik Mahjoub, for example, he used to say things that you would even say today, right? He would be like, man, I hate the disposition that we have so many bourgeois people in our party. Imagine going to like this to like a communist thing. It's like, man, why are there so many rich people here? I don't want. I know we shouldn't employ any more academics. It's either like we need to employ midwives. You know what I mean? He was upset by this, and it was something that I mean, maybe I don't know if he was upset, but like it was something that he addressed. Said, I did this. We don't need this anymore. We need to have like people from the things. And so, this is a tradition that you're proud of. It's an honorable thing. It even had like results that were quite phenomenal and like, successes electorally and otherwise and extra parliamentarily and so on and so forth. And so why was this spirit not carried on to like the moment of the revolution in Sudan? And one of the things that most historians agree on was that the moment the left died was basically in the late 60s, early 70s, with the dictatorship and Numeri, who maybe we'll talk about later. Um, he basically was a pan-Arab socialist of the Nasserite type, and the Communist Party or Abdul Khalid Mahjoub's faction of the party had disagreements. Like he used to openly go into the radio and like cuss him out, and then he would and the mayor would cuss him out back, and then he had to flee to like Egypt because there was warrants and like it was a little bit difficult. Abdul Khalik Mahjoub, the leader of the Communist Party, had to flee to Egypt because it wasn't safe for him and so on and so forth. Um, but then there was like a random or an arbitrary coup that that factions of the Communist Party sort of tried to do and to Numeri's coup. And then this was foiled with the help of foreign influence with Egypt and Libya at the time, also pan Arab socialist governments. They sort of foiled by allowing Numeri to use the radio from Egypt, for example, and the plane that was carrying the co-conspirators of the coup was sort of forced to land in Libya, and the coup failed. Basically, the coup failed. When the coup failed, basically, Numeri literally killed and imprisoned and prosecuted all leftist and all communist members of the Communist Party. And Abdul Khalik Mahjoub was, executed along with his comrades. May they rest in peace. And that marked the end of the left in Sudan. What came afterwards was, what came afterwards was a left in Sudan that, for we can describe it in different ways, but one of the ways in which I would describe it, at least materially, it sought to forge relationships upwardly with like the NGO classes, elites in the academy, and so on and so forth. And this sort of had a direct effect with us during our revolution, where it was a moment of revolution, but many communists were in themselves part of like NGO organizations and like the UN and like these kinds of places, which were the forces which basically, as a counter-revolutionary force, which I call them in the book sort of ontologically motionless, because they don't really do anything. They just see a situation in which conflict is happening. They're like, everyone needs to stop. This can be like Israel stops at like literally, stepping in the necks of Palestinians or whatever. It's just an ontologically motionless thing. But this is how they were not co-opted, but this is the decision that they made. Now, that being the case, it is what it is what it is, what you can say about it. But at least how I understand it is, I do understand if literally being a communist meant being executed, put into exile, your life destroyed and so on and so forth. You can excuse and, maybe even understand the position of like these people who wanted to create upwardly alliances because it was much safer. You know what I mean? But and this is an important, I think, lesson even for us today, because today we can be like, what's the harm with like doing these NGO works? It's okay, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you know, um, Amnesty International or working for the UN or whatever. Yeah, it's not revolutionary, but it's the most civilized way in which you can reproduce yourself under capitalism. And sometimes you do some good work like Albanese or whatever. For us, what we have to learn, not just from the Sudanese Revolution, but also for maybe listeners or people from all over or people who are, because people have these thoughts all over the world. It's like, okay, I can go into the academy and produce myself in a way that's it's one of the most civilized ways you can reproduce yourself under capitalism. But just as a historic note, what this ends up doing is at the moment of revolution, like Sudan, when we needed the left, there was no left. So it's you are people are right, and many people are right that the most civilized way to reproduce yourself under capitalism is the NGOs, the UN, and the academy, and maybe even parliament or whatever. That's yeah, and like no fault there. People have to eat, but the reason why there was no left is literally because of that. You know what I mean? So maybe food for thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I do think that that is is by design. Truly. I mean, not to get like overly conspiratorial about it or something like that, but I do think that there is an understanding by the capitalist ruling classes sort of that absorbing, even though, I mean, and it's contradictory, right? Because you also have the right, like in the United States right now, which is currently in a full-on assault really on universities, on nonprofits, and so on and so forth, partly because they know that they have absorbed the left and they don't want them to be safe there either, right? But I do think that particularly among, maybe we could describe this broadly, among kind of liberal capitalist thinkers, they're like, well, if we build these foundations and these nonprofits and these universities, then, we can absorb these revolutionaries and give them salaries and benefits and things like that, and we keep them out of parties and organizing and connecting with the masses in a certain way. And whether it's an intentional thing or not, I agree that at least we can all agree that it performs that kind of role. I think there's a really good conversation that we had with Abdul Jawad Omar about insurgency and counterinsurgency in the West Bank in Palestine, and he talked about that historical kind of process and how it really had it's difficult to talk about a left in Palestine that isn't absorbed into those kind of sectors, that is actually an organized force. Which of course he also then takes a step further to say this is why it's important to support resistance factions, regardless of whether they identify themselves as leftist, or we can kind of see that because they are fighting against imperialism and Zionism and so on and so forth. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I 100% agree with that, and I think also it's absolutely correct. I mean, it's not conspiratorial at all. Like that, like for the Sudanese situation, this is literally, I learned this not because I was reading it, because I saw it in front of my eyes. People who would say the most radical things or whatever, but they were hampered from like organizing because they were attracted to these institutions. And in fact, in fact, I said this somewhere else. These institutions are, for what they claim to do, are completely useless. Completely useless. If you talk to people in these institutions themselves, right? Like GIZ, for example, had like initiative of like um vocational training in Darfur, for example, right? If you talk to like literally, they're not even radicals. They're just like white Germans who come to Sudan and to have like a tax free money or whatever. But even if you talk to them, they'll tell you explicitly the initiatives that these British Council, the GIZ, the UN, whatever it is, it doesn't just not work. Sometimes it can even be counterintuitive and destructive forces. Not a funny, but a tragic story was in Juba when Corona broke out, COVID-19 broke out. In some places in South Sudan, sorry, next to Juba, I believe, there was no cases of Corona because there was no migration like that. That's that far out. And now, the UN had this initiative to go and like, I don't know, educate people about vaccines. And the reason, the way COVID-19 was transmitted to those people and killed, members of that community was because of those same people coming in to teach them about the vaccines. You know what I mean? Like sometimes it becomes so ridiculous. But the thing is, when you're a leftist and you're defeated, and you hear advertisement that I don't know, GIZ is going to try and I don't know, provide solar panels for this many communities, or teach these girls and this, it's always Oriental, these girls in these communities, how to read and how to use, I don't know, I don't know, like technology or whatever, think technology or whatever. And as a leftist, you're like, ah, yeah, you know what? Since I know this knowledge or whatever, but I don't have anywhere to go and I to reproduce myself. This sounds like a good thing to do, but it's the best thing to absorb revolutionary energy, and it's the worst thing for doing what it claims to do. This like NGO. So I have 100% agree with your guest and yourself as well.
Yeah, I mean, that also is my own experience, I think, in a lot of ways of like, you know, many years ago coming out of college and, having some radical ideas, but really no like good political education and grounding, and just like also just looking for a job, right? And like, oh, I could work for a nonprofit and it seems good because you're like, I care about people. I'll get to do something. It's just like on a basic level, it pulls a lot of people in. Um, and the alternatives within a capitalist system also are so bleak, right? So it's I think it's understandable in a certain way too, why it works so well. So let's move into the Sudanese Revolution a bit again. We're kind of going to jump back and forth, I think, historically, but um, you know, the neighborhood resistance committees, was something that was, I mean, a lot of beautiful images and discussion, and people, I think, found these, I think rightfully like very inspiring, and was a very inspiring time, obviously, for people within Sudan, also people from the Sudanese diaspora. I remember we had Bador Allegra on a long time ago, and she was doing, I think it was even a discussion we were having maybe about Sylvia Winter or something like that. But she also, it was right in the midst of that, right? And she like, just wanted to talk about it because it was such a inspiring thing. I think also given the fact that the politics of Sudan had been so kind of, I mean, I think of my friends at a Hukuki Kalk party in Pakistan, and talking about how the reality in Pakistan for a long time has been that the politics has basically been something that has been denied to people, right, in many ways, through the kind of, sectarian and just the way that kind of the military's role also within the government and things like that, that even a space for politics is hard for many people. And so then when you have something like this, it is truly, amazing in some ways. And, you know, now we're 6, 7 years on, and obviously you have the benefit of hindsight and also the experiences of, living and participating and being a part of this and experiencing, like you said, that um, the energy of it, the galvanization of it, the beautiful things that you all were, the memories that are forged and the possibilities in that kind of moment. But also thinking about why doesn't it translate to something else, and so share a little bit of your reflections of the neighborhood resistance committees. And I believe like they still exist, right, in certain forms. And that you in the book you talk, I think, very well about both um, what's powerful about them, but also some of the things that limit them in terms of what they're able to do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the bastards, they took down our fucking paintings, man. Like the drawings and all. So, sorry, am I allowed to swear? I mean, still, yeah, okay,
Yes, you can.
okay,
Yes, you can. Feel free.
okay, okay, okay. Okay. But the bastards, they took down our paintings, man. And you are right, they were beautiful paintings. And I remember sort of to give a story, we were we had like sit-ins, and the sort of revolutionary audacity of us was to create these sittings right in front of the military bases, right in front of the military bases. And I remember after we sort of secluded this area, like this area was sort of secured, and it was just populated. No cars were going through. It was completely sort of vacant from. It was somewhat. It was like a seed of utopia. If you can imagine, a place where there's no cars. People would leave their shifts at the hospital. Doctors and nurses come and have like this moving clinic. People will sort of convert a tent into like so for example what we did into like a library, and in this library there's people who have like vibrant discussions, and discussions like sometimes we sort of may patronize like these movements or whatever, but creating them and the things that were happening during these moments. I mean, we were discussing, for example, Vivek Chabra's book at that time, or his thing about the debate between Marxism, or his Marxism and like post-colonialism and stuff like this. Um, where there was another group that was discussing, for example, new theories of like consciousness that go beyond sort of like a binary understanding of consciousness limited to only the political, but rather to use like different categories or whatever. People were involved in, like, there was debates, for example, philosophically about what's like, which is ongoing debate, which is like what's more like meaningful about like if you had the history of the world, if you had the history of like world philosophy, and this was like a theological debates, and like all the Qurans in one hand, is it okay, is it permissible to burn all the Qurans or all the world history? And there were people have like vibrant debates about a variety of different topics and what's going on. And simultaneously, you had people who constructed these sort of sit-ins in ways that were unbelievably strategic. I mean, you couldn't get like better engineers at like constructing them. People would not just construct them based on the season, like, okay, at that time it's going to be a little bit colder than this time, and there's going to be a breeze coming from the Nile. We need to make sure that from this road to that road, this place, there's no cars, so that you have a breeze coming into like this place. And we know that the military is going to attack at best from this area. And so if it's going to attack at best from this area, we need to have much more blockades so that it's harder for them to get in this way, and so on and so forth. And the way they were building these blockades were very important, like, architecturally, for our survival. You needed to leave like a small slit in the middle, so that, what's it called, motorcycles would go through, in case like the police or like the paramilitary or whatever would come, and then we'll throw like we'll sort of would go like head to head with them. And then if someone gets injured, you can send a motorcycle, and the motorcycle can go through it, through these barricades, and the police wouldn't be able to, because they come with like these big trucks. And then you have to also know what kind of trucks that they're going to use. There's trucks, for example, that have like these hoses on the top, where they fill with like basically wastewater. So and it marks you. So like when you go home, like you can be stopped and searched and all these kinds of things. You need to know, for example, how many people you were at different days, depending on how like people's routines and so on and so forth. And then, depending on how many people you are, you organize your resistance towards the military in different ways. You need to have much more people in the middle, for example, when there's not a lot of people, so that you can have people making noise. So you have sort of auditory resistance, so that they think you're more people than you are really. You know what I mean? Whereas if you are a lot more people, you don't need to show, like it doesn't need to be like calls and stuff like this. So like you have to imagine the vibrancy of this place where people were talking about all kinds of things. And then the people that came, there were people who are just not political, but came there not because we had people that would come and talk to us that were at all not political, at all didn't get, but because they saw like it this just gravitated so many people into this, and immediately radicalized, and things that you were not able to say, like, or things that because you've committed to like an irrational revolution, like the things that are irrational were not even able to be said. If someone comes like I'm thinking, if it happened today, if someone comes and goes like, oh yeah, AI is like really great and stuff like this, it just be like, you don't have to say that, bro, it's okay. And, you know what I mean? um and so like you had like this real vibrancy of not just things people are talking, people are doing and creating, new knowledge being forged, new knowledge at the moment being forged, like we talked about science and so on earlier, and so on and so forth. And that was basically how I remember these moments. I forgot your second question. I need you need to you need to tell me the second question.
No, no, I first of all, like, I super appreciate, that you went there with all of that because I think that, I mean, I can't imagine at any one of these moments or these, movements or revolutions, like, they're all, they all have their own, energy and dynamics and contradictions and all of that stuff. But as you were talking, like I just wrote down, I'm thinking about, you know, the Russian Revolution and afterwards, like people who had never experienced going to the opera, like being like, I want to check this out, and and talking about different ideas and all of this, and then you know the Cuban Revolution and all of it that this unleashed, and but then also thinking about examples that are closer to home that would probably be closer to the experience of folks that are in the West, right, which might be participating in Occupy or, the student intifadas, on college campuses and things like this, right? That like, even if it's not on the scale or with the energy dynamics and possibilities quite of what you all had in that moment, those what you're describing in terms of what happens with people in these things is something that I think people have experienced some like form of that if they have participated in some kind of struggle that goes out into space and kind of resists the dynamics of the state and capital that want to force everybody out of that space and back home, and then you realize that, I mean, at the student intifada I'm in the Philly area, like, you would go to visit a college campus and, yeah, you would see these libraries set up and, people discussing theory and books and, all of these things that would be also, knowledge and, um even though it would be at a university, it wouldn't be anything that would be taught in the classes, right?
Yeah.
So it would not be things that, were I mean, maybe some of it, but, like, very most for the most part, you're talking about people like, "Oh, let's read Ghassan Kanafani," or, something like this, right? And, I think that there is something about, obviously, all of that that is deeply powerful and transformative and so important. And also, I mean, you talk a little bit about it even in relation to those same, NGO folks are like, where was the left in this moment? That sometimes in these moments with the left, and this is true, I think, maybe not I don't want to make a universalized statement, but in many instances, the left sort of looks at it and says, well, that's not going to succeed, or that's not, it's not organized in the way that we would do it, or whatever. And so then doesn't actually actively participate, or isn't in a way that they could participate, except maybe as a few individuals, right? And so on and so forth. Um, and
No.
misses out on all of the possibility, energy, mutual learning, relationship building, all of those things. But the second part of the question was, this discussion of, limitations, right? And I'm glad that you didn't start
Mm,
with like
mhm.
a patronization of it, and kind of talking down, because I do think there's many ways that we've had a lot of different versions of, well, the reason that all of these movements didn't succeed is because of XYZ, which a lot of times that analysis is correct, right? But it can be, in a way that does kind of diminish the beauty and the power of those moments as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna say a couple of things before getting to like the limitations. I think, firstly, for many people on left who say, I mean, there's a revolt. No, no, maybe a revolt is too strong, but like demonstrations going on in India today, and you can have like a lot of people saying like, oh, it's not in this way, it's not in that way. They're wrong about doing this. It's like satiric. It's not political. These kinds of things, man. Yeah, honestly, this is so it's just so weird. Like, it's just words from a weird dude, man. Like what I described, just like it's wallahi, it's just so weird. What I've just described, right? Forget, let's say they don't know anything politically. Us in Sudan, and just like the people in India today, or before that, it was in Bangladesh when they ousted the president, and so on and so forth. Do you understand that we're talking about 18, 19, 20, like maximum 30-year-olds who overnight managed to figure out the best way architecturally to block roads for a specific situation to protect people's lives and ensure that there is like places in which people can maneuver in order for them to send back like the injured and so on and so forth. They didn't go to university, studied engineering or like architecture. They created these things literally not because someone brought sand and like cement and blah 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 stuff. No, they literally took rocks like the pavement, they disassembled it and but put it in a way that is for their own purposes. They've created life science there. You're talking about it doesn't mimic the Soviet Revolution or the Russian Revolution because of some weird. It's just you're a weird dude, man. Like it's not even a critique towards him. It's not a critique at all. It's just an antisocial behavior, unfortunately, you know. So that's my response to that. But you know, I remember one time to produce like an anecdote. One time I talk about this anecdote during the in the book. Um, it was the June 3rd massacre in Sudan. It was in the sit-in. So the sit-in was like destroyed by like the paramilitary came. That same sit-in, the paramilitary and the military came in and basically at the early hours of the morning destroyed the tents that we're discussing and all these infrastructures and killed some people and raped some people and it was really horrific, and we woke up to the sounds of this and to people telling us about. For me personally, I was there the night before and I went home later at night, but I woke up later and I found out about this. you know the moment of loss that we felt, like, it was devastating. It was, a place in which, everyone, imagine waking up and being like, okay, I have a libertary vision today. I have a story. I have an urge. I'm going to go. You don't share it with the people at home or like people outside. You take this feeling, this energy, this revolution. Like everyone has thoughts about, oh, I should have an interesting about. You take it and there's a place for it to be disseminated, to be integrated, to even be practiced at times. And you go to this place in which all of us came and dumped our liberatory horizons on. our thinking. Like we worked together and we debated and we created things. We created random things, like the things that you're talking about. For example, the paintings. The paintings are wonderful, and these bastards will forever have like my ire for like destroying them. But honestly, for me personally, they were not the most interesting things. For example, we would be there talking. I have a picture with one of my comrades talking, and some person was painting one of these murals or things, in the background. It was nice to look at, but it's just to represent because we were there, we were alive. We had so much potential. We had so much things to talk about and actualize. For it the next day to be destroyed by these paramilitary military forces, not just destroyed, but indiscriminate killing and raping and just, for them, it was, even though it was peaceful, even though it was a declaration of a Russian war, but it was peaceful and so on and so forth. But for them, it was just the audacity of our even existing beyond the mute compulsion of like the everyday or whatever. And so, when I woke up to this, I got, naturally, I couldn't see anymore. I was blinded with rage. We walked. There was the internet was down, so you couldn't organize. I can't remember if the telephones were down, but I think it was just the internet. And so I went and knocked on a couple of comrades' house in the neighborhood in which where I lived, and we sort of walked, and the streets were basically blocked off. There was no cars, or the cars that were very limited, and they closed everything down because they were afraid of like basically what we're going to reply with. And we walked in the heat. It was the last day of Ramadan, I believe. We were all fasting, and we walk in this incredible heat, and trying to find more comrades, but we can't be too many because at most junctions there were like these paramilitary military forces. So even then we had to produce knowledge and like, okay, how do we maneuver these spaces strategically? We'd be 3 on 3, and we didn't have communications. We left our phones somewhere, and then we would meet at different places. So we need to have like better geographical areas. One of my comrades jokes around, is like, I've never known Sudan more so than after the revolution, because it forced me to like understand the geographies of these areas in order for me to navigate it, which is not, this is also the stories of like African resistance and to slavery in the Americas. But either way, we had to be intimate. We had to produce a new knowledge of geographies and so on and so forth. We get to a certain place, a neighborhood that's known for its resistance. I would see in a matter of hours, they've built up like, barricades. And behind these barricades, we sort of, created like, some, cocktails, Molotov cocktails, and like other things, because it was a matter of war. Like this time. This time they shot they shot, even though they did kill martyrs before, but this was an open declaration, a flagrant declaration of just, you know, uncivilized, barbarous warfare against us, right? And so we created like these bombs and bombs is a strong word, but like these cocktails, and we stayed there, angry, like unbelievably distraught. You have to imagine just, none of you have to imagine that in our faces is like this sort of somber. It's like people not engaged, not talking, not, they weren't crying or anything like that, or perhaps they were crying but silently or whatever, but just people who are just going for a purpose. You know what I mean? Like we are walking towards something for a particular purpose, and that is it. We get there, we build, and we sort of, every car that comes through, every person that comes through, we search in case they're like infiltrated and so on and so forth. Some tried from paramilitaries, and we sort of launched some cocktails on their cars and stuff like this. We managed to fend them off, even though it wasn't, they didn't attack us, and they chose wisely. I think they didn't attack us, but they stayed there for intimidation and so on and so forth. And basically, when I went home, or afterwards, we went home and so on and so forth. There was this fucking I see one police officer just standing there, and I thought to myself, my fucking lucky day, man, my lucky day. And I jump on this fucking guy, basically try to wham him, and like I'm blinded by rage, and I sort of jump on this guy. I think get a couple of licks in, until his friend was there, and he sort of, with a Kalashnikov, he sort of stops me and takes me off, and the rest of the story is in the book. I say this anecdote, right, because it's funny to me. Years later, I read in the works of someone like David Graeber, who was a major figure in like the Occupy movement, right? And he says, not in so many words, but he says, for example, the Occupy movement retained some of its radical elements because it was inspired by the Arab Spring, what's called the Arab Spring, by these revolts. You said I had like the privilege of retrospect. It's such what we were doing there, what I've just described and much more, rippled. It's not just what happened in Sudan, but the m- people didn't see what I was doing or what any particular person was doing at the time, but they were hearing about, and this rippled. It sort of amplified the radical elements of like even movements here in the global minority. This isn't just about Sudan. Even the resistance in Palestine ripples to radicalize people in the global minority. I would even say radicalize, but to civilize the left in the global minority. This has been the case for like Vietnamese, what's it called, resistance to French and U.S. empire. It's been the case for the Algerian resistance towards the French, and so on and so forth. This anecdote for me is it's interesting, and always when I hear like David Graeber, when he said, or when I read him saying that, what's it called, this sort of inspired like some sort of radicalism thing. It is really, really, really. It's not about. I don't think it's about the global south, global north, but how these things actually ripple. And so I say this. Perhaps I talk longer about this because what I say about the limitations, yes, it is a critique. But what am I critiquing? I'm critiquing people who have civilized the global left. So it is a critique, of course, but it should be seen in that light. For many of us who were either part of the resistance committees or adjacent to, we were young. You know what I mean? I was I was in my late 20s, mid late 20s at the time. Mm, mid 20s at the time, and the dictatorship itself was 30 years old. So we're talking about the vast majority of people who were part of the revolution. In some days, every single person that was in the sit-in or was in the revolt, in some days, was younger than the revolution, than the dictatorship itself. And when that's the case, we thought in our head the biggest problems of our time is the dictatorship. When it comes collapsing down, it's going to bring about something different. Just like it's naturally, right? Just like today, for example, we think about the biggest problem, like for example, facing us today is like capital and capitalist accumulation, or like certain, you know, certain circuits of accumulation within capital. Even if we destroy the Zionist entity itself, let's say, if we destroy the Zionist entity in itself, does this mean it's going to stop white supremacy? I don't know. I don't think so, right? I mean, these are things, but you have to imagine, for us, this is a microcosm, maybe even a lesson for the left. Just the destruction of the dictatorship did not mean that it's going to be liberatory. But this is what we understood, and this is what we believed, and this is what we've been taught, not naively, but just as a matter of fact. Like the world has some justice in it. The world has this, and we are going to be like you know, we should be fighting this great enemy, and this great enemy is a great enemy, and the enemy that we all know. And so when sort of when it tumbles down, some things are going to change, and that's how we acted, because that's what we saw within each other. I remember, sorry for like, I'm going for too long, but sorry for this. I remember during the sit-in, I met someone who we had like a fight years ago because like we stole, like money was stolen and things like that happened and stuff like this. And like we're going to an altercation, but and other people that you have like animosities towards or whatever before. But you mean during the sit-in and stuff like this, all this dissolves in the face of a greater enemy or like thing. All this just means nothing, and you create new bonds and so on and so forth. So this is what not just what we thought theoretically, but what we practice practically. It's not like, okay, we're all in this liberty together. We see what the potential, what we've managed to create in the sit-ins. This surely is just going to be reflected after the collapse of the dictatorship. Unfortunately, we just didn't have enough knowledge. Maybe knowledge is a bad word, but we didn't prepare ourselves for the dynamics that were behind the dictatorships. These are faces, is what we needed to understand. These are not, these are not gods that control the destiny of reality or destiny of man or society or whatever. But these are faces. The dynamics behind them is we need to understand them. And part of the book is, you know, tries to do this. Um, yeah, I'll stop there. Maybe I've talked a little bit too much.
No, I think that's great. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all of those reflections, and it's honestly, it's like wonderful and a pleasure to hear you talk about the experiences of it as well. Um, the one thing that I noted, and this may be like common knowledge to a lot of folks, that you did kind of talk about a little bit within the book, um, was that the neighborhood resistance committees also, though, have they won't involve themselves in formal political parties in some extent. And like this is also not a. I don't say this like even as a specific critique of them either, because this is also a broader pattern that I also see in many instances of revolt or and at least in the case of the neighborhood resistance committees, there was some form of organization and structure there, and sometimes it's even more amorphous and diffuse than that. Um, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, now and how you think about that question at this point.
Yeah, I mean, to relate it to what I said earlier, which is once you think like this is the big enemy, then you no longer you think this things that people are doing called politics, parliamentary politics, or these parties, they're not needed because all we need to do is just destroy this enemy. And so you get the impulse, right? Like for many people, or at least some people. Um, and so they decided for the resistance committees to be explicitly non-politically affiliated, not party politically affiliated. And this is how they ran. And the problem with this, factually, I think was, you know, I think the problem, like maybe at the chicken and the egg situation, a lot of parties try to infiltrate, maybe infiltrate is even a wrong word, but like try to be part of the resistance committee to like sort of introduce ideas to the resistance committees, neighborhood resistance committees from all specters. It could be, people who are previously in the government. It could be the sectarians that we talked about, the mainstream parties. It could be even people, communist, even Ba'athist party members as well. I remember someone coming and approaching me. Um, try to like be part of the resistance committees and influence it in certain ways. And I think this also played a role in the resistance committees. Perhaps this was a wise reason, I'm not sure, but not being politically affiliated because it was just so transparent. And like I said, we're relatively young, right? And you're like, you've done something that's quite impressive, quite something that not your this generation managed to do. Not that it's a generational thing, but like these people managed to do. And then afterwards you have these people coming in trying to like promote some sort of party line or some sort of like thing. Your repulsed is a strong word, but like you get a sense of like, bro, what are you talking about? Like, it's just yeah, okay, maybe it can be interpreted as arrogance or whatever, but also it's understandable as someone who's just participated in something and being part of something that's great. And so I was like, yeah, okay, why didn't you guys do it then? You know what I mean? It could be arrogance, it could be like anger against like a useless political system. It could a manifestation of many different things. And it could be all of these things all together and more. What do I think about, the decision to be non-politically affiliated? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I mean, these things are, I wouldn't necessarily put a judgment on it. I know, for example, some of the friends, some of the people that, some of the communists might say, for example, we should have had a party, and this party should have absorbed this revolutionary energy, and this would have been helpful, and so on and so forth. Like we talked about, and I think you also mentioned, there are structural reasons for it to do with like the NGO class and so on and so forth. That's why we didn't have the political parties available and the thing. Maybe, and maybe even like the political parties that did, if there was a political party that did exist during the time of the dictatorship, it would have been influenced by the dictatorship for better or for worse. Maybe perhaps as an alternative or something maybe interesting is a political party should have been born by the resistance committees themselves, but it was so horizontal. Like the resistance committees was so horizontal that it was hard to even control. And I don't mean this, from like, for example, um, who represents who and talks about what and does this, and you know what I mean, like to integrate it into like a movement that controls like state apparatus and all these kinds of things. It wouldn't been, if that was the aim, it would be very difficult to do. But perhaps, I don't know, maybe I don't talk about these reflections in the book, but perhaps this is maybe a fundamental question, one that left movements throughout the world and throughout time have been grappling with, which is taking hold of like state power for a future sort of uh, uh, um, incremental sort of move towards socialism by like having power, or is it better to like just try create your own sort of organizations, and these organizations expand to the moment when there's a revolution and they sort of naturally dissolve the state, and like this transfiguratism, I think anarchists call them, versus like state captures and stuff like this. These are reflections that we need to have, and the debates are lively. I don't know if there's a clear answer. I wouldn't be. I mean, I'm not. I'm not like on a. Sorry, I'm going hard on like some of these leftists, but I'm not antisocial, man. I'm not. I'm not gonna sit down and judge people based on the moment in which they exist. Maybe that if we didn't have the Zionist entity, for example, which is a major hindrance towards liberatory prospects. I think you had a guest, Nihal. Ah man, I forgot.
Yeah. Nihal El Azhar, is that right? Nihal El Azhar? I I have to double check, but yeah, she's the one. She did some conversations on Egypt.
For sure. And her analysis of like the Zionist entity, fantastic. And maybe if there was no Zionist entity and there was no like one could sway towards one end, and if there was, one can sway towards another end. But these are things that happen in the moment, you know what I mean? And I personally don't have an answer which way is better, and so on and so forth. Um, if I can say one thing about the book, I know this is not the part of the question, but just thinking about it now that I mentioned the Zionist entity, one of the things I think I would sort of insist, not even insist, but I would persuade people to like read the book as one of the reason why maybe these plans were foiled was because there were like some sort of conspiracies to make sure that the revolution doesn't continue and so on and so forth. And the Zionist entity was part of these conspiracies, which literally provided the fucking tear gas canisters and like military equipment to suppress us, literally, not just as a matter of thing. Which is, you have to understand, man, like I remember the day, like before they were supplied with like Israeli grade tear gas, the tear gas was okay. You know what I mean? You go, you get tear gas. It was okay. You know what I mean? It wasn't the best, but it's not too bad. I'm sure they got it like from the Soviets like 20 years ago. Maybe some of it doesn't work properly, it's like shooting blanks and stuff. It's okay. When they got that fucking Zionist shit, bro, man, that motherfucker stung like a mother. Like it's so bad, right? What you had to do was basically go in with one of your comrades who's already been through it, get inoculated, because the moment it touches your skin, it sort of it hurts in your eyes and across your it hurts inside your eyes and across your eyes, and you sort of become immobilized. I don't know what the experience. I don't know what the fuck they put in this tear gas, man. It could be whatever, and they immobilize you. So you have to go in, get inoculated. Your friends drag you back out. You do this like once or twice or three times or whatever until you can roughly manage, and then you sort of continue to go to the front lines and so on and so forth. But that's just to say this is just part of like the logistics and like the technology that Israel provided, like the counter revolutionaries and the paramilitary and the military to suppress us. I think for this book to relate it to this book, you have to imagine for the Arab Spring or for the revolutions that were going on in these regions, there were tens of millions of people that were part of these revolutions. This book is a reflection of just one person, like a biased reflection on one person. And I think it's quite an interesting reflection. Maybe you might disagree with it, with some parts of it, you might agree with some parts of it. But imagine if you wouldn't have the fucking disturbances of the Zionist entity and the capitalist forces and capitalist alliances and stuff like this. Imagine how much fucking freer, or how more achievable the prospects of liberation would be. I think that's why I think it's important to be anti-Zionist. Yes, because of Palestine, 100%. But even if the Zionists, their case of like, even if there was quote unquote no people in the land, you still have to be anti-Zionist, because it's really an expression of white supremacy and domination and stuff like this. But sorry, I just came to my mind.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, any opportunity to to be anti-Zionist is welcome here. Um, so, you have a section of the book that you talk through kind of a number of clinical case studies. And there's too much in this chapter really for you to go through all of them and things like that. But perhaps you want to talk about like a couple of examples, and some of the meaning that you draw from the case studies, and bring your psychotherapeutic work and psychotherapeutic analysis that you are kind of moving through in this book, because it is a big part of what you're wrestling with this book, and maybe to some, to add another layer to it, like how that's influenced kind of how you think about the politics of these things.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said earlier, or I started to talk about earlier, it's the usual therapeutic modalities or the usual psychotherapies. They were not fit for purpose during a revolutionary moment. It also turns out there was no fit for purpose outside of revolutionary moments. And I think this is something that I sort of try to. Was something that I was struggling with during when I was practicing in Sudan in the front lines. And one of the things is, I like it just had to be done like, perhaps maybe didn't have to be, but I wanted to develop a new psychotherapeutic modality that you know um, engages with the challenges that we were facing at the moment. And I think the reason why is, like I was saying earlier, it was unsatisfactory to think about whether society reproduces man or man reproduces society or something like this. When you have someone in front of you, it was like I was maybe this is the wrong word, but I keep on using it. But like it's counterintuitive to like completely collapse a theory into like what the person was saying at that moment, and like sort of try to compartmentalize the different words and the different meanings, or even to allow them to experience something that is basically an illusion, or whatever, and not talk about something that was actually happening. Um, and I thought, you know, for me personally, if I was going to a therapist, to maybe a little simplify a little bit, what would be interesting? Or in fact, forget a therapist. What were the most interesting moments or one of the most interesting conversations that people have had or that I have had? And I think, like I said, the greatest scientists are those who take the words of the people seriously, especially people in revolt seriously, and try to understand and contribute and enter into a debate. And one of the most, I think, for many people and for myself included, the most meaningful conversations that you have are ones where the words theory and science is being developed in the spot, in the moment, in these conversations. Even like with the conversation here today, right? Like you asked me about the irrational revolution, and I thought about something that I haven't thought about in regards to a thing. And these are the most fascinating conversations. And I think in therapy, that's the case as well. It's a moment in which, a session in which theory is developed out of it. It's not collapsed into it. To put it um, maybe a little bit more simply. Um, and I think, for example, the reflections were there's case studies that people can go read and in the book. But in one more a recent like case study that I had, just to give as an example of what I mean by this, right? Is there's a person that I was that came for therapy, and this person basically there was like a sort of incestuous behavior that was initiated from this person's part towards their younger sibling, right? And we're thinking about this, right? Because for them it did not make sense, because it was like, I regret it now, and we don't really talk about this, and um I don't know how to make sense of this, because we have like a strong relationship. But is this something that is hidden? If it comes out, is it going to destroy do we not talk about it? Do we not address it? Because like you know what I mean? What does this mean for our relationship? Why did I do it? And the person was young, you know what I mean? Why do I do it? It was curious about this. Um, this phenomenon, this traumatic phenomenon that happened, right? And so during the session, we were talking, and one of the things that we were talking about or saying was, well, how was your relationship before, or how's the relationship when you guys were younger? And this client told me that basically, um, that their mother sort of insisted, because she had a certain understanding of feminism, equality between men, and this liberal sort of this liberal form of feminism. We don't need to get into like too much details, but a liberal form of feminism, where she would demand that the domestic labor be done by the boys. And my client, who was a girl, who's a woman, but was a girl, um, was not to do as much domestic labor, because the boys had to learn not to be patriarchs and such. And so, she saw that in a weird way, it sort of created a paternalistic relationship between them, because now she saw what her mother was doing to her, the mother was doing to her brother, and sort of militated against this, and was always on the brother's behalf. um, which meant that the woman actually committed more care labor towards the brother, because of the forced domestic labor that the brother was done, because of a certain understanding of feminism that her mother's had. And then she said that this sort of meant that this care labor gave her more power in the relationship, and more access to their personhood, because for them, they were in charge of them being happy or sad. They were in charge of forms of resistance towards a parent, because the parent was so domineering, and they were the woman was older, and so on and so forth, so she could stand up to their mother a little bit more. And what we understood during this therapy session was basically that the subsidization of care labor, emotional labor towards siblings, for siblings towards other siblings, like from the parents, from siblings to other siblings, is not just a subsidization of care labor, but also has an element of authority into the personhood of the sibling itself. And so she thought, as you know, it was when they were younger, right? Like as a young child, you have like sort of maybe sexual curiosities or whatever it is, and because she had control over the personhood through the emotional labor that she was committed to, this curiosity played out, through sort of forms of, like it's sex. It wasn't rape or something like this. It was just touching and whatever. We don't need to get into the details and stuff like this, but like it wasn't a thing. But you know, in even though this is not how they understood it, but because these are the dynamics that were forged by the subsidization of care labor by parents to children. Now, you see, like this case study, for example, is a case study that from it you produce theories of, for example, how should we understand incest generally. I mean, incest is widespread, and there's some theories that explain it and stuff like this. But the theories that explain it in this meaningful way, I think, are quite are very few, in fact. And to understand it as like in a political way, in a way that is, you know, care labor shouldn't just be something that's subsidized or secondary to productive labor, for example. And if you do so, you allow for the domination of siblings by sort of allowing siblings to have more authority over the personhood of a different sibling because you've given them the authority to do so, basically. Um, and in a moment of sort of sexual curiosity, this can lead to different outcomes. This is a small example of the revolutionary potential of not collapsing into, as a lot of these therapy psychotherapy theories does, collapsing theory into the therapeutic session, but rather creating theory from the therapeutic session. And the reason why they collapse it is because fundamentally most psychotherapeutic theories, behavioralist, humanist, even psychodynamic, to a large extent, they have not resolved the question of, like, does man reproduce society or does society reproduce man? Because this question is too late. First of all, you need to answer the question that we've sort of been, flirting with throughout this conversation, which is, how is society legible to us um, in the first instance? And here is where real therapeutic work sort of happens without getting into too much detail, and where theory actually um, sort of is produced.
That's very interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, so there's a set, you talk in the piece about how like there are these certain moments. Um, I don't know this was lead us that fruitfully into the next question, but I'm gonna reflect it as before I get into it anyway. Um, but you do talk about how there are these certain moments in which Sudan becomes kind of globally legible, or it becomes a kind of news story. And I mean, it's an interesting reflection, I think, especially living in the imperial core, in the reality that like our media is terrible, right? But it like doesn't tell us anything about a place. Like we don't learn any. We never are taught like histories, and if we are, they're taught always from a very like colonial or imperial kind of encounter with places and so on and so forth. Um, and so the truth is that most people in the West, myself included, don't know that much about the Sudan, about Sudan, and so your book is very useful, I think, in helping to add some elements of that knowledge for folks for sure. Um, but there are these moments, obviously the revolutionary moment that we talked about a little bit. The current civil war in some ways is legible in some form, really just through kind of atrocities or something like that, right? Like, and then for folks like myself who are old enough to really remember this, there was a big kind of NGO, internationally driven Save Darfur moment as well, which, many like Hollywood figures would get, connected into and things like this. In the early 2000s is really when I kind of remember that being most prominent. So the question that I have here that kind of connects to some of these is that you do try to trace some of the different things that are going on and that connect these events in certain ways, which I think is really valuable and important, right? Because as we get them, especially those of us in the West, it is just sort of like through this of, oh, we need to, like, literally the idea of save Darfur for, right? Like, you Westerners need to give money to this thing so that the NGOs can go in and, save, right? Like, it is a very, white saviorists, kind of thing that kind of gets brought in that just doesn't even deal at all with, like, what are the historical dynamics at play? Um, so the question I had is, you write about different historical events and the development of forces related to Darfur and Khartoum in the same chapter that you really dig into the Sudanese Civil War, which obviously is ongoing. Um, as I mentioned, a lot of us remember that Darfur through that lens of the Save Darfur movement, as really, and I do think this is true. It's one of the first times I grew up, in the 80s and the 90s. I don't really remember ever encountering Sudan in global discussion in that period of time, you know. Um, and so talk about the historical events you're tracing here. That kind of connect some of the different things within Sudanese history that, produce, say, that moment of Save Darfur, produce some of the, maybe we could also use this to talk about, some of the racial regimes, right, that you discuss, and some of, because that is, I think, a very interesting thing, within Sudan, but also, like, kind of within North Africa very often, where you have this kind of the way that, Arab and Black African relations get kind of created by a political entity, which very often I think can be collapsed in the West into sort of these discussions of Arab anti-blackness and racism, which I don't want to, like, um, evacuate that conversation, but I think it's also maybe more useful to think about what produces, like, what has produced that in specific, locations, right? So yeah, and you kind of, through this, you do trace the development of the forces that are kind of responsible for the Civil War in a certain way, or how do these forces get all these arms, right? These kinds of things, and how do they develop into these political forces? So I know that's like a very big question, and I will just say, like, you can take it wherever is interesting for you to kind of discuss here.
Yeah, I think in my head it's like there's so many different hot like really really even at this moment like very very like contested debates around the questions that you pose, especially when it comes to like uh racism, Arab racism, and how racism develops, and is racism is like directionally towards white supremacy, or is it like sort of more, and all these kinds of things. But I'll try to do I'll try to do my best to engage these. I think to start off with, you're absolutely right. I think most people would remember Sudan from the Save Darfur sort of era, which is, as some people see it, the 21st century's first genocide, actually, 2000, in the early 2000s. Um, And I think the reason why there's, if even till today, not just Darfur, I think the reason why, even many, even maybe even left-leaning Sudanese people might want to like demand sort of these, liberal institutions and like diplomatic ties be sort of used to like, I don't know, ensure condemnation towards the UAE and a hope in these institutions, which is quite weird because these institutions have, I mean, basically shown an incredible lack of care or even acknowledging, I don't know, even the basic sort of facts on the ground. But I think it's not a psychological issue. I don't think it's because some of these people might not know better. I think it's more so structural, or a theoretically structural problem, which is, sometimes people see the woes of Sudan are explicitly tied to, who has their hands on Sudan. It's only seen through like an infiltrator perspective, like this country's this imperial aspirations has sort of seen fit to use Sudan for a particular purpose to fight off. And Sudan is only seen almost as like this cradle um, of groups of people who exist with each other somewhat harmoniously, and it's just this foreign interference that sort of plays like a huge role in determining the sort of the destruction of Sudan and so on and so forth. And I think once your entire political analysis becomes the UAE has entered into Sudan and destroyed Sudan, and that's just that's the height, that's the beginning and end of your political analysis, then it makes sense for you to be like, well, okay, we need to make sure, because it's an external problem, we just need to make sure that these external actors are defeated in some ways. And so there's nothing to do internally. We just need to fight it externally. We need to sort of exhaust all our diplomatic means, political and social cachet, in order for us to influence the civil societies, to sort of rally against, the UAE and so on and so forth. Cool, sure. You can see that, and that's the truth. The UAE is thing, and you can do this. But even if you stop the UAE from financing, the RSF, and even, you know what, if the RSF itself dissolves in Sudan, capital accumulation and the circuits of capital accumulation within Sudan is not going to stop, and is intimately linked to the Gulf countries. In fact, before the civil war of 2023 in Sudan, before the war that broke out, the biggest businessman in Sudan, Osama Dawood, wanted to have like a partnership with like a UAE companies to basically build a new port in Sudan to, ease the sort of extraction of Sudanese resources to the Gulf countries. No one batted an eye. In fact, Khartoum itself, which is the capital of Sudan, which is where a lot of elites live, and this is where the accumulation of capital sort of lands. Many people, even those same activists who call for these things, many people and their families, were privileged in their class position by exploiting the relationship, or by being part of the relationship of capital accumulation between not just Sudan, but Sudan, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and so on and so forth, and their relationship to the Gulf countries. This relationship is what needs to be tackled, but not this humanitarian. And I think this is all to say is like, looking at it from a humanitarian lens is short-sighted, but I don't think it's a psychological problem. But it's just, you're thinking, if you think that this is the only problem in Sudan has, then you're mistaken. And this leads us to like the question of racialization. So where does this capital why did this capital accumulation happen? Why does it happen? What does it lead to? How does it destroy Sudan? And how should we understand it? In the book, I trace it basically to 1973, the Yom Kippur War, which in other texts and other histories has been, I think even your guest Nihal also spoke about it. In 1973, which is the Yom Kippur War, the Arab states were devastated by Israel, and in retaliation, the Arab state basically decided to divest from the West. Now they invested in Sudan to create Sudan as a breadbasket of the Middle East, North Africa, or West Asia and North Africa. And in so doing, one can think, okay, well, they're investing a lot of money in Sudan. This could be like a good thing. But the problem is, what this did was put in place basically the destruction of, and the continuous, or the intensification of racialization in Sudan. How it did this was basically, when your industrial policy is to create basically cash crops and just send them out abroad to be like a breadbasket. What it means is you don't upskill your laborers, you devastate your land, and you basically bring in sorry, you don't upskill your laborers, you bring in these large technologies to devastate the land so they can produce major crops, creating in the in create destroying in the meantime the sort of forestation, and you sort of deforest like the different places around Sudan, which contributes to basically the how climate change also affects Sudan, which is through desertification and deforestation. What it means practically socially for people is generations of people who have used the lands and have used lands in very very creative ways. So for example, um, and not in sort of monoculture, what do you call it, like not just like one sort of species of plants being produced, but so for example you'd have like, I don't know, cows coming in and sort of like stepping on the land so that you can like flip the land and like try to make it ripe so that you can like fertilize it again, and like with the hide and so on. So there's like an ecosystem of like social relations engaged with like the land, with the animals, and all these kinds of things that have been going on for generations. This were happening in the peripheries and like in different areas, not in the urban centers. Now, when you have like an influx of land, you need to take this particular land because it's known for like, agriculture, but also because there is a laboring class or like a agrarian class of people who will do the work basically. You go to these places and the first thing that you do is like, where is the deed to your land? We're trying to find investment opportunities for this large cache of money so that they can occupy like lands here so that people can work. Many people won't have the deeds to these lands and they will be kicked off of it. Now these lands would obviously like sort of um, people say survey, but they will destroy the geography of these lands because people like like when you sort of survey and create like these enclosures, it's not just the enclosures that you sort of take over and you destroy this land, but you also the route of migration and like how communities like engage with this. So this also part of life and part of social relations. You also devastate or you sort of impinge or like destroy at different rates, of course, depending on the thing. But you also destroy the migration dynamics. And so you had like these people come, or like the government of Nigeria at the time after 73 come in and basically take large swathes of land, sort of destroy the topsoil, and kick people out of places in which they survived off. Now these people, they would, because you would devastate the topsoil, they would use this land, destroy the topsoil, go to a different land, like millions of acres. It's just like the destruction of land. When they leave, these same, if they leave, when they leave, these same, what's it called, the agrarian workers, they can't do anything with this land anymore because they don't have the capital to purchase like these big machines, obviously, but also the topsoil is destroyed, and so they really can't do anything about it. And also the migration patterns and like it destroys a lot of things in these societies. What happens is those same laboring classes or agrarian classes, they start sending their children to urban centers so that their children can, I don't know, do this proletarization thing, go to like maybe attempt to do like a university degree, or not a university degree, maybe like some sort of vocation thing or whatever it is, or like work as petty traders or domestic laborers, most likely, to be able to get the money from like this newly found elites and capitalist classes, the capitalist classes now in Khartoum, who basically export these, raw materials, or enfranchise like, French companies or German companies or British companies to like that have like these big technologies, who work for these sort of families and like their kin and like the thing as basically domestic laborers. And as domestic laborers, like I said previously, you don't have like an official contract. The forms of exploitation are outside, like there's no remit, there's no sort of limit to the exploitation that you're exposed to. Anything can happen, but not only anything can happen, and you're dependent on them to send money back to your family. So you're in a situation in which, you are completely stripped of dignity. You use certain tools in order for you to bargain for leverage some dignity. So for example, a small case of like this funny how these things work, but let me just give an anecdote. There was one of these rich Khartoumites who employed many domestic laborers. And you know I don't know, these rich people, they have a funny ethics, man. They're like, oh, in order because I'm so magnanimous and so nice and so charitable, I'm going to send the child of my domestic worker to the kindergarten, right? Of course, not the same kindergarten as her child goes to, but well, I'll send her to the kindergarten. The domestic laborer herself told her that I'm not going to allow you to send them to kindergarten unless you increase my pay. Now you see forms of resistance towards this domestication, the domestic, the domestic. I think is slavery. This form of like what's it called, modern day slavery, basically, in very very different ways, because they understand the sort of liberal ethical impulses of these newly found capitalist classes, and um, uh, the new houses of these elites, and they sort of maneuver it in difficult ways, because at one point you're like, okay, if you want to be a good person by sending my child to school, I'm going to not allow you to send my head unless you increase my. So like there's different forms, creative forms, because in like these sort of arbitrary spaces, like different forms of resistance come about. Now when these people who are in the outside of these urban centers come to urban centers, they come from different areas. They can come from Darfur, they can come from the west, they can come from the north, they can come from South Sudan, but in areas where their devastation needs to be naturalized. So you see here the hints of racialization start to take roots. These people are, it starts off with like, oh, um, they're just agrarian workers, they're just simple people, they're just, they, positively it can be like, oh, they're just hardworking. I give this example as like the Mexicans, for example. People positively racialize Mexicans like, oh, they're hardworking, they wouldn't do anything like these white Americans would do, you know what I mean? Which is positive racialization, but racialization nonetheless. It starts off like that. And then once they start coming to like these centers to justify their, to continue that domination, to justify that domination and so on and so forth, they're seen in like, as the process of racialization takes root, and it's a historic process and so on and so forth. This is in the back. Maybe I'm not, maybe this history is in the book. I'm not going to get into it, but like the process of racialization continues to intensify and take root, to naturalize their servitude to the newly elites in Khartoum, based on like this sort of huge investment of money that creates the industrialization through financialization, by importing these franchise companies and like selling off like simple resources, or like natural resources. And so here you see basically this dynamic of racialization, which is to do with like the dispossession of people from land, couple with the racialization as the dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir going in to destroy South Sudan, because there was a rebellion from South Sudan which wanted to unite the two countries, and in a secular fashion, and by a president called John Garang, and so on and so forth. It also corresponds with the racialization of West Sudanese people, because they couldn't take any rebellion from West Sudan. Otherwise, the country of Sudan, the city of the city of Khartoum, which is like the center uh, of Sudan, the capital of Sudan, is going to collapse, and the powers of accumulation and the circuits of accumulation are going to collapse. You see here, this sort of racialization taking place because of certain political dynamics and so on and so forth. But I think it's important to understand these political dynamics in relation to racialization, because sometimes people use racialization as like, oh, Arabs have always had this antagonism towards like Africans, and there might even be like hints of like Afro pessimism, which is not. Look, people critique Afro pessimism. I don't think it should be critiqued too harshly, in my opinion. Um, Shout out Tommy Curry, but I don't think it should be critiqued too harshly. But It's not sort of this Arab natural sort of antagonism towards like Africans, and this is why it's just the manifestations would. No, there are political processes that have happened in the background that created the conditions, and in fact, the policies that sort of discriminated against, like, people who are racialized. A good example would be, for example, during that same president who introduced financialization by allowing after 72, the same dictator, when the people came to urban centers, even during his reign, that's how quickly like these sort of land dispossessions happened. He started a phenomenon called al-kasha. Al-kasha would basically be like the military or the forces would go around neighborhood and literally racialize people. If you're an Ethiopian person, coming as like cheap labor to Sudan and domestic labor, if you're from South Sudan, if you're from West Sudan, taking them and literally dropping them off in the wilderness, in like places that maybe some places that have been devastated by the same dynamics in them. You have policies that are directly tied to racializing these people. And so I think sometimes people try to understand even what happened in Darfur as like, well, there's natural Arabic, dispositions. Before I get to Darfur, let me just say one thing. This, for the government itself, in order for it to legitimize its the government of Omar al-Bashir, which is the one that we overthrew from 1989 till 2019, in order for them to justify their existence or like to cement their hold in power, they needed to promote themselves Arab supremacists in Darfur, in west of Sudan, to maintain this sort of domination through race and through capital and capital accumulation. But also racism was a huge factor. They did that on purpose. There are policies that they financed, literally took the guns from the literal police in Darfur and gave them to literal Arab supremacists. And these Arab supremacists increased in their supremacy because now they have the power to, and these are political decisions that have happened. This, just to stick on this theme for a bit, of this history for a bit, this is what precipitated something called the Janjaweed, and then later on precipitated what is now known as the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, by literally the military funding these Arab supremacist group, which are literally the forefathers of the RSF, direct lineage from the RSF. And they were done by explicitly what's it called, racialized or racialist um, policies. The reason why I say this is because there's a lot of analysis about Sudan about like there's a natural antagonism between Muslims and Africans and so on and so forth. That doesn't explain what happened in Sudan, man. Like it's not just like, oh, they were just not like, they were just naturally sort of antagonistic, and the Arabs had more power and then they destroyed it. It was a political decision. It also another unhelpful way to understand it, which is like racism can happen to anyone. Look, here is like black people who are like racist towards white people, and brown people racist towards black people, and it's multi-directional. But in fact, the racism as a technology that was engineered by the various governments of Sudan is quite literally and explicitly mimicking racial capitalism that is explicitly white supremacist. It's a mimicry of that explicit thing. Racism should be understood as this direction. It's a white supremacist. It's a directionally white supremacist. So it doesn't go everywhere. So I think these two ways of understanding race in Sudan is a little bit, I think is fundamentally flawed, and it leads us to like much more problematic assumptions. And I think in the book I try to like trace the political sort of dimensions of this the race question in Sudan.
Yeah, thank you. It reminded me a little bit as you were talking about this of like, um, I mean, one, I do think that I agree. I think there is a lot of useful stuff within Afro pessimist theory, but I do think that question, right, of like the politics, right, is a really really important question, and it allows for specificity sometimes that not all of those works necessarily delve into because they're operating at that meta theory level, right? You said technology of power, and that's something that Alana Lenton talks about within her work quite a bit of racial regimes and so on. Um, but let's go back because you were going to return to a conversation. You kind of, I think, tabled or bracketed off for a second a conversation on Darfur. Was there more that you wanted to say specific to Darfur, or did you kind of sort of lay that out in that?
First of all, the technology of race thing about Alanit is very. I think this is why I gave her a shout a shout out in the beginning is very helpful, and to respond to um, like the question of race that it's multi-directional, man. Like 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 Wallah Azim, I'm on government support, and like my family, my wife and I and our child we're poor and stuff like this. And maybe like this is something that maybe we don't see and stuff like that. You know, we go to so you have like a special card. I don't know if maybe I think in the US you have something, but you go to a special card where you get like a special supermarket. At certain days that you can get like cheaper food and stuff like this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, in the US, it
Um,
would be like SNAP, which is being like eviscerated by the Trump administration, but basically like historically, like kind of like food stamps or something like that, you know?
right, right. Right. Yeah, I've heard about yeah, that's crazy, man. But yeah, so alhamdulillah for us, it's still not being it's not being devastated yet. Let's wait for the AFD to come into power. Um, but I like funny. One of the funny things is the most amount of racism that we receive is like when we go to like these poor settings. Like like you're like we're poor and yeah, we're equally with people there who are like might not have a lot or whatever. But the most amount of racism like we receive is like from them. And I think it's really because of liberal anti-racist policy, like thinking. Because you're like, okay, then if like racism is like, okay, everyone needs to like have a bandwidth of like to like teach each other to be like thing, and you don't look at it structurally, then you're literally at the whims of the goodwill of the people who quote unquote belong to a certain culture or country or whatever it is. And so you receive the most abhorrent kind of racist interactions in places that it's like, bro, I am really not your enemy. You know what I mean? Like, but that's the policies of like, that's the naturalization of like this liberal anti-racism. That's why I kind of go hard on them. But yeah, uh,
A- As you should, as you should. Yeah,
yeah.
for sure.
To talk about Darfur a little bit, I think I'm just going to say a couple of things, maybe because I did touch on it elsewhere and here as well. Mm, but you know, I think the reason why I bring this specific understanding of race and racism towards Darfur is because this is how we should understand it. Racism plays a significant part in understanding how the destruction sort of unfolds in Darfur, right? Because you had simultaneously in the 90s when the newly dictatorship comes into office in the early 90s, it's struggling with this huge rebellion from South Sudan led by this guy called John Gurren. May he rest in peace, Allah yarhamu. John Gurren, I don't believe in like many people, they don't believe in like many people on the left, they don't believe like great man of history or whatever. But he was a great man of history. He was really responsible for like giving the necessary sort of vigor and like strength to the independence movement of South Sudan. And for him it wasn't independence. For him he wanted to unite both Sudans and create like one secular Sudan and stuff like this. But he was behind like this revolutionary force. They couldn't engage with like, it was a formidable force, a formidable rebellion from the South Sudan. And one of the only ways in which you can retaliate towards it, because the for various reasons the military at the time was sort of diminished, its capabilities, was forcefully inscript people. So you imagine you're a dictatorship that newly came in. You have this major rebellion. You forcefully conscript people. This forceful conscription It's one of the most unpopular policies that dictatorship has committed, period. Throughout its 30-year history, this is one of the main things that made it so unpopular because so many people died as cannon fodder for this to rebel against, to quote unquote, to fight off the rebellion from South Sudan or from the South Sudanese. One of the ways in which it did so, and to justify this forced conscription, was to increase this racialization, this racial policies. It was purely political. Darfur, on the other hand, in West Sudan, equally just like South Sudan, it had a lot of people. It was a place where there was like a lot of, it was a huge place of land, like many investments were there, and blah, 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 like similar dynamics. And more importantly, labor to reproduce Khartoum and urban centers came from Darfur and came from South Sudan. Many domestic laborers in Khartoum and in urban centers are themselves even to this day, and like maybe not during the war, are from West Sudan. So even the flow of these cheap racialized labor was significant, important for the reproduction of society itself, Sudanese society itself. Now, in order for you to continue this flow, you need devastation. In order for you to have cheap labor, you need devastation. You continue to devastate this place, you get cheap labor, but also you need to create, supremacist, or a supremacist ideology in that area in order for you to maintain your hegemony, like I said earlier. And this is how we should understand the context of Darfur. This doesn't, the reason why I say you should understand it as, like, in the context of white supremacy, because this destruction itself, it doesn't just help Khartoum and Sudan itself. This destruction literally helps build the UAE itself, or like the Gulf countries, because it even provides cheap labor where these people no longer have labor in, like, Sudan. They have to go and work as like literally modern day slaves to build these towering fucking buildings in the UAE and Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh and Doha and all these places. They need cheap labor. So you need to ensure this mimication of white supremacy happens in these places in order for you to have like this disposable labor and stuff like that. And that's why I say, like, Darfur is integral, is important to understand, yes, for Sudan and thing, but also how it relates to the wider sort of domination and capital accumulation and even the building up of like Gulf countries, because it is directional. Like these whenever there's devastation, not just in Sudan, not just in Darfur, in Egypt, in Tunis or Tunisia, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, whenever there's like weak sort of, whatever it is, like racialization, devastation of like labor laws and, urbanization and, the agrarian poor just being like funneled into urban centers where they can't fit anymore, they have to be sent. Whenever that happens, it's directed literally towards these sort of the Zionist and Zionist adjacent and like Gulf countries, for them to build what, funnily enough, Andrew Tate calls the safest places on earth. you know, you know what I mean. So it we need to understand it in these senses. Basically, this is what Darfur is. An analysis of Darfur through race or racism is quite important.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and those dynamics, actually, I mean, it reminded me a lot of what you were talking about there, of like the accumulation of wastes, right? And that theoretical work as well that Ali Kadri and others have done. Um, all right, so we'll close it. We'll close with one more here. So, you do close with some discussion around organizing and deal with something which we've talked about a little bit in this discussion, maybe through some other registers, but the realm of social reproduction, right, and social reproductive labor and all of this, and I really, the one is very interesting and timely, because we just did a little like short study session where we um read a piece by Arlene Eisen and also another piece by Paris Euros and Archana Prashad in a study group, and a lot of what it was talking about was the Euros and Prasad piece like deals a lot with agrarian transitions in the global south, right? And a lot of the dynamics that you've talked about, right, in terms of like what happens with land, how do people get displaced, and then what type of work, if any, are they absorbed into, and the fact that there's not adequate, industrialization to absorb all the people who are displaced from the agricultural society or the agrarian society into some form of like full industrial labor, right? So what does this produce? It produces many instances of various forms of informal work, maybe gig work, things like this, but also care work, social reproductive work, and so on and so forth, which is those dynamics that you're talking about that basically put people in slave like kind of conditions quite often and so forth. So I think it's, timely just in my mind, because this is something that I've been, thinking about with folks for the last few days. Um, to that you're calling in part for that as a key space of organizing and kind of revolutionary potential. So yeah, go ahead and share some of your thoughts on that.
I think you're gonna get me in trouble with a lot of Marxists. The- um, but, but but maybe not. I think
Maybe
like
not
like
the
on
not the Marxist feminists at least, but
yeah, for sure. Which I consider myself Marxist as well. So yeah, maybe we need to have a rediscussion or a re-centralization of reproductive. But honestly, my honest response to this is, before I've during the revolution, this book is supposed to be an unbiased reflection of the conversations that we're having in the revolution. For me personally, today I wouldn't come to the same conclusions I've written in the book. I think I would have said many things differently and stuff like this. But I try to be as faithful as I can in the book about the conversation to the conversation that we were having during the revolution. During the revolution, like for example, I don't know, I wasn't familiar with the work of. Oh, I have for everything like Susan Ferguson, for example, social reproductive feminism, the debates between, for example, Melinda Cooper and like Nancy Fraser and stuff like this. Like these things were not I didn't know them at the time, but what I did sort of experience was some of the most revolutionary moments that we had was when, as the resistance committee, when we went to like different people's homes, when we were part of like reproducing society itself. So it could be anything from like going to neighborhoods in the neighborhoods and being like, oh, you know um this old person lives here, but she has to go up the stairs because her apartment is like separated in a weird way and her stairs are made out of metal. So when you do drop off the gas canister, make sure to pick it up and put it all the way upstairs. Okay, so we'll need to make sure that Eamon takes this thing because he's more able-bodied. Um, and then, for example, we'd have a conversation about even more private things about like this particular person is abusive, and I mean, I just give like a direct anecdote. For example, I remember during the war, one of my comrades called me, or before the war, sorry, one of my comrades called me. Is like, "Yo, this person is abusive towards their partner, and he caught her with another person that she was in love with, who blah blah blah, like this sort of affairs. What should I do? How should we engage with it, and so on and so forth." So we're having so many different sort of discussions and things that were not in a factory, that were not productive, that were not in like tech companies, that were not to do with like direct bosses, but more so to do with like how do we reproduce societies and social things. From it, we had so many interesting debates. And the conclusion that I come to with like social reproduction, it wasn't out of reading necessarily like a feminist social reproduct Marxist feminist literature or social reproductive feminism or radical feminism or something like this. But it's things that we were sort of engaged with in the ground. And I think it was, for me at least, I mean, of course, many people, like you said, like you mentioned, have talked about this. Both of us have mentioned, have talked about this, but it wasn't immediately intuitive to me. Like for a lot of us, what the Marxist orthodoxy would suggest was like, you're going to go to work, and in the work, you're going to see you have the freedom to go to work. But you see that this freedom is stifled because in the work, there's certain dynamics that make you unfree. And this is in relation to the domination of your boss. And in this domination, you come together and, you sort of, bargain against like better conditions and blah, blah, this kind of things. Actually, what we find is that the complete opposite to be the case, which is like people go to work and themselves become fucking assholes. They naturalize, what's it called, capitalist logic. In fact, they're most, not everyone, but a lot of them like naturalizes like, yeah, I deserve more. Like I put in more hours. This is the labor that should be counted, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the more radical conversations that were being had were people who didn't go to work and people who are like doing reproductive labor. And this is the milieu in which sort of I was thinking about these kinds of things. And sort of I draw it a little bit more philosophically in the book, and maybe we don't need to go into this, but this is the milieu in which we're talking about. And so for us during that time, and for me personally, even even today, the reason why social labor is so revolutionary is because it is a labor to sustain, and I think feminists have been talking about this. Certain feminists have been talking about this. Is labor to sustain life in itself, society in itself. It's not just to sustain sort of a growth imperative, or a cumulative imperative, or like a profit imperative, or whatever it is, but it's labor to in itself reproduce society and life in itself. That being the case, necessarily the things that are going to come out of it, like, forget theory, like not even theoretically, it's so much more charming to have a conversation with someone while both of you are on equal footing to reproduce society than having a conversation based, like, I don't know, like the Eye of Zoron or whatever, sort of like, you have like this sort of I don't know, panopticon just like beaming down at you. It's like, oh, produce, accumulate, and stuff like. It's much more wonderful. It's much more charming, and it's much more revolutionary. And so many things come out of it. And here, I think, in the distinction in the book, I make a difference between not productive and reproductive labor, but social labor and proprietary labor. And I think both of them should be seen as labor, but one of them, the proprietary one, is like, it's to sort of take social labor, or which is actual productive labor, that um and what's it called, social labor is the one that sort of people come together to actually produce society, and actually, or reproduce society, and actually produce existence, basically, which is important and has like a revolutionary potentials, and where actual revolutionary praxis comes from.
No, that's great. And it reminds me a lot of, Chris Gilbert's work in Commune or Nothing. He's thinking with the Venezuelan communes, which fortunately are still standing at this point, despite the kind of imperial assault and capture that that country is under right now. Um, but that, there's this whole he introduces a concept which I just encourage people to check out in his work, which is directly social labor, and he talks about it within the commune context of yeah, just this revolutionary process that they've developed, basically, where the labor is exchanged within the commune in a kind of direct manner, and like what that means when you're actually engaging in that way, and it's outside of those circuits of extraction and capital accumulation and so on, and the democratic and revolutionary potential. And it comes out of these reflections too from like theorists like Isvan Meszaros, thinking about some of the critiques that he had of the 20th century socialist model, and thinking about that need to which Chavez also took up, that need to build a commune as a new organ to be basically built up over time to replace capitalist society, that you have to kind of start by the way that people are relating to one another. And I think that what you're describing, is another kind of form or variant or discussion of that, of those different terms that you've experienced within those organizing spaces of being able to, uh, you know, to work with others in those kind of terms. And I think there is a lot of potential in that. And I also think that even from a strictly Marxist, vocabulary that might want to uphold a more traditional theory, there becomes this problem now of there are just less and less industrial jobs in the world, right? And so if you want to organize people in the spaces that they are working, a lot of it is going to be you know, in spaces of care work, of social reproduction, and so on and so forth, because it is just sort of I mean, I'm sitting here podcasting and then I do social labor, like, so like that's what, this is my life at this point, and for various people, it's all kinds of different versions of that. But, there aren't that many of us, especially in the core, but I think it's also true. It is true in the periphery as well, that just the portion of societies that are involved in industrial labor, it's not going to be it's not going to get to some point where we're all doing that. That's just not going to happen. So
For 100%. And also, like I said, it cannot be labor divorced from just the profit motive. It's just that's just the aim of, I mean, it's just the aim of it, right? I mean, what kind of struggle? Sorry, I mean, like, I don't want to be too hard, but I 100% agree. And like, the vast majority of the world, the very vast majority of the world is doing care labor. The very vast majority of the world. In fact, like, exactly like you said, industrial labor is just diminishing. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, yeah, sure. It's like there's a hydraulic effect. Of course, there's more, perhaps in China, perhaps in like parts of Asia, and so on and so forth. And but these parts, even these parts of the world, for various sort of political dynamics and maybe even racial dynamics or whatever, I'm not sure you're going to be able to get through to them without a politics of social labor. I don't think you'll be able to, because, like, the capitalists have I think the capitalists have learned from the rebellious masses of the industrial workforce. And I think they've learned valuable lessons. And one of the ways in which we can sort of counter this, I think, is through care labor. I could be mistaken. Maybe this is just like a preliminary thought, but I think care labor is really key, and especially in a world of um, yeah, where migration is more and more going to play a significant role with remittance and all these kinds of things. Care labor is super, super important, and yeah, social labor is super, super important to focus on.
thank you so much. I don't know if you have anything else to say as we close out. We've obviously talked about a lot today, and this has been a really fantastic conversation. Again, I definitely want to encourage people to log on to iskrabooks.org, download it, check out some of your other conversations, and buy it and support the book. But anything else that you want to say?
No, no, but just thank you for having me on. And yeah, like we were saying before this, honestly, like, um, it's surreal because millennials are killing capitalism has been like a political education for me personally. It's been a super enlightening sort of listening, and being on this side of the podcast, I think, is also really nice. And thank you for having me. Um, yeah, for people who want to find out more about the book, you can get it for free on Iskra. You can also buy it. Um, but yeah, yeah. Um, not much. Thank you for having me. And if anyone's listening out there and is interested in the work that I do psychologically and stuff like that, you can also reach me at, if I made the website, it's called notatherapist.de. Um, yeah, yeah. If people are interested in these things, reach out at the
Abso-
psychological parts.
Absolutely. No, no, thank you for sharing that. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, man. Have a good day.
You too.